Welcome to Tech Out West, where we unveil the tech leaders of tomorrow, today. I'm Paul Mikesell.
And I'm Sarah Lindquist. Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind the startups, the visionaries, and the relentless spirit that defines entrepreneurship in the wild frontier of technology.
Today on Tech Out West, we have Ed Lazowska. Ed Lazowska is the Bill and Melinda Gates Chair Emeritus at the University of Washington and has long been one of the main driving forces behind computer science and the CSE department at the University of Washington and throughout the region and the tech community here in Seattle. So Ed, maybe you can tell us about what is the Bill and Melinda Gates Chair Emeritus? What is that title and what does that mean?
In universities, some people have endowed chairs or endowed professorships. And what it does is convey, honestly, a certain amount of appreciation and status, and then some money you can use for any scholarly purpose. And I was honored to be the first holder of an endowed chair that Bill and Melinda Gates provided back in the year 2000.
Wow.
And after 20 years, I turned it in. So emeritus means used to be.
Oh, got it. Okay.
I just decided it was time for somebody else to own that.
Okay. When I was at the University of Washington, you were chairman of the department.
I was,
chairman
yes.
of the CSE department at the University of Washington. So I'll tell you one thing. When in my early adult life, Ed, you were one of the very first adults that I met that treated me as a young man like I had some value and some worth other than, you know, how many burgers I could flip or how many boxes I could load. And what I learned from you is that it's okay to think that computers are cool and fun and interesting. And this is before there were, startups were making money, right? This was just us, me and my class growing up and becoming young adults. And I think finding out for the first time that there's a group of people out there that thought computers were great and rad and fun and all this stuff. And then startups happened and everything else. And it was cool to see how our relationship over the last however many decades has evolved, because I was one of, I don't know how many students, but actually, I think in my graduating class, could this be right? I graduated in 96. I think we had 80 people who graduated
that year.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Wow.
We went 40, then 80, then 120, then 160, and we were stuck at 160 for a decade. And we're now at 630. So we've grown a lot over the past 10 years.
Yeah. It was...
That's cool.
It was a whole different time. That was when we were in Sieg Hall, right?
Yep.
And so the building was falling apart. Ed used to hand visiting prospective graduate students and professors a piece of the building.
Chunks that fell off the building, That was
like drywall?
Our best. No, it was aggregate falling off the vertical supports outside. I think the thing was supported on I-beams, but there was concrete and rocks around it. And it was just falling off in little piles. Okay, so one year, you had to do something to attract students because the place just looked like hell. And we decided as a joke that we would give each of them a piece of the building to take home as they made their decision about where to go to graduate school. And that was actually our highest yield year ever, the year I did that. Okay. Yeah. So gimmicks work.
Yeah.
so let me say what you said was really lovely. I appreciated it a great deal. And I had a very similar experience in college. And it started with a negative experience. Okay. I thought college was going to be different than high school. Okay. In high school, I sat in the basement and studied and, got straight A's and did great on my SATs and got into a decent college. And the first semester of my freshman year, I got the highest grade on the chemistry midterm. It's a big class, 160 students, something like that. And the chemistry faculty did what you'd expect them to do, which is they started browning me up and trying to get me to be a chemistry major. And this threw me into just a state of despondency, okay? Because I had thought that to succeed in college, I would either have to or would have the opportunity to do something different than in high school, which was sit in the basement and study. And that's what I've been doing, okay? And I realized that I could be very successful at a top Ivy League school by doing the same damn thing. And so I crashed completely. I got like a D in second semester physics and stuff like that.
Oh, interesting.
But I discovered a programming course and fell in love, okay? And the interesting thing there was as I moved along, it was the first time in my life I'd been treated like an adult. Okay. And way back then we had undergrads engaged in research. I was. Okay. And the idea that a faculty member would trust me to do something that he himself didn't know how to do was just mind boggling. Okay. And that was just transformative for me.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just, that sort of thing makes a huge difference.
These are the kinds of things where, I mean, I think it's part of going to college, of course, but there's something about a technical skill set like that where you realize that you're getting traction mentally and professionally that is life changing. And I don't know that you get that in other like non-STEM fields because it's not, to my mind at least, it's not as objective as an evaluation metric. Like you either got the problem right, you got it wrong. Program works or doesn't, right? And in a non-STEM field, I have a hard time seeing how to know the evaluation is tracking to what you expect, right? I know before I hand my program in if it worked.
Well,
right?
here's what's cool. You're building something.
Yeah, you're building.
Okay, and either it works or it doesn't.
Yeah, sure.
Okay?
Right.
And it's incredibly rewarding to build stuff. And I think undoubtedly, like me, you used to love to do that when you were a kid. For me, it was erector sets and, those stupid log cabin kits and stuff like that, and it was just, eventually, actually, I had a computer called a Brainiac K30, which I guarantee you haven't heard of, but it was a big piece of, there's that, press board that you hang tools on the garage in. It has little holes on 1 inch centers, little hooks you put in them. Well, it was made out of that. It was like a 2 foot by 3 foot backboard and a set of discs. And then this bag of parts, little wipers and nuts and bolts. And, you would build several digit adders out of it and stuff like that.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, this sort of stuff we just loved. And software is the opportunity to do the same thing without having to get a screwdriver out.
I guess people emulate that today with, some of these visual programming languages.
Sure.
Right. Even Unreal Engine 4, which is the program. One of the ways to build like VR systems. We used this at Oculus for a while. There's a visual language that very much maps onto that. It's not building an adder, but you're building logic flow out of something that looks just like that. What's the video game that people play where you smash blocks and stuff?
Oh, Roblox? It's not Minecraft or anything, is it?
Minecraft.
Minecraft.
That's what I said.
Okay, Minecraft. Okay.
People are building logic, and they built. Somebody built an adder in Minecraft. That's like in mapping onto the real world would be like the size of like Bellevue or whatever.
Yeah.
That can add numbers together. And it works just like a regular logic adder. Cool. Okay. Well, where did you grow up, Ed? Where did you?
So I grew up in Washington D.C. in the city. Went to public schools. My dad was a lawyer for the Department of Justice. My mom was a librarian. And my dad and mom intended that I become a lawyer, which meant that I had to take 5 years of Latin in junior high school and high school, which actually was certainly the hardest course I took in high school. I had no problem with science and math courses. Okay, Latin was very tough, and the Latin teacher was my college counselor as well. And I remember going into her probably my junior year in high school, and she took a look at my transcript and said, "Who gave you a B?" Because there clearly had been one. And then she looked and discovered it was her.
Too funny.
Anyway, and I have to say that my sister, who spent, I think she was more focused on pleasing my parents than I was, to be polite about this. She became a lawyer because that was the expectation. I deviated from the plan.
Wow. So you had to study Latin because all of the phrases and terms are in Latin, right?
I think there's a bunch of Latin mumbo jumbo in the law. Anyway,
remember when we were talking to Peter, he was lamenting that you can't get Latin anymore.
You can't. No.
That they pulled it from most of the optional curriculum in most of the schools now. And he had said he'd actually written to his old school to try to get them to bring it back, but
well, it was really challenging, and the readings were great. Fourth year we did Catullus and poetry and things like that. It was really interesting, and the it occasionally pays off. And I remember the summer after my senior year, I had a job in Connecticut and went to Boston on my own for the first time and wandered in and out of churches, which I always do. And a lot of the old churches in Boston have Latin expressions on the wall, which I could actually read. And it was, I have lots of fun in graveyards these days.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. So, that's compelling.
So how far is it? So going from D.C. to Boston on the train, how'd you get there?
Oh gosh, I was in Connecticut for the summer, so I believe I hitchhiked to Boston for
Did you?
a weekend with some friends. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
And this was your senior year of high school.
this summer after my senior year of high
After
school.
your senior year of high school. So what were you doing? What were you working on?
What was I doing? Well, the other geek thing to do back then was to be a ham radio operator. Okay. And I was sort of a big ham radio operator as an upper teen in Washington, D.C., and had friends all over. And a friend was working for an outfit called the American Radio Relay League, which was the sort of membership service organization for ham radio operators. So I got a summer job working for them. And you can't be paid to, for example, run their ham radio station. It's amateur. So what we were paid to do was reply to letters from people who had canceled their membership. Okay. And, you know, I still remember the standard phrase was, "I am deeply distressed," blah, blah, blah. Okay. So we just sat there on old manual typewriters and pecked out these deeply distressed letters to try and get people to renew their memberships to keep the place afloat.
Oh, that's awesome.
So do you remember? So do you have your license still? Your hand?
Yeah, I let it lapse, I'm afraid.
I don't know what the current like the recurring requirement is.
It is very easy to get it restored, in fact. Okay, and I just haven't done it. This could be a retirement trick for me or something like that. But I have a set of friends here, sort of ex-Microsoft folks, who are pretty active, actually. Wow. I mean, it used to be back when long distance telephone calls were expensive, for example, you would make cheap calls by patching into a ham radio.
Mm-hmm.
Guy to go across
they would bounce around. They could bounce all around the world in different.
Yeah,
there's some atmospheric condition where things travel better, right?
Right. So the radio waves bounce off the ionosphere, and sunspots, of course, either disrupt it or make it great, depending.
Okay, got it. Do you remember the frequencies? Do you remember anything about the frequencies?
Well, sure. That the HF bands were 80 meters, 40 meters, 20, 15, and 10 meters. Okay, and those are the wavelengths. So the frequencies were from 3.5 megahertz to 30 megahertz. Okay. And then very high frequency was a 2-meter band and on up.
Okay.
But I remember nothing. I was mostly a radio telegraph operator.
That's
Morse code.
So how'd you find it? Like, is it something you just found on your own?
I have no recollection. I started when I was 12.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's really cool. Okay, so you mentioned you have a sister. Do you have other siblings or just a two?
Nope, just a sister.
Okay, older sister.
Younger sister, 2.5 years younger. Yeah.
Okay, so you being the oldest, you have parents who want you to be a lawyer, taking Latin throughout school, and then tell us about when you kind of discovered your interest. So I know you were explaining earlier about how you would be down studying and trying to do really well in school, but when you feel like you discovered like what things you're actually really passionate about?
Well, there's a computer story to how I wound up where I went to college. Okay, I went to Brown as an undergraduate. Okay, and I was in a snit with my mother and wasn't being diligent about applying to colleges. Okay, and
were you not wanting to go, or you just?
I was just always arguing with my mother. It's what
for the sake of it.
It's what obnoxious boys do. Okay, and so. My best friend in middle school and high school was a fellow named David Boggs, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Boggs was the co-inventor of Ethernet with Bob Metcalf.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And Boggs was the engineer who made it work. That is, he actually designed the Ethernet interface. Okay. So Bob Metcalf, a brilliant guy, but his PhD thesis at Harvard and MIT had been binary exponential backoff. He was demonstrating why the radio network in Hawaiian Islands, Aloha network, collapsed under high load. Okay, that is, it would sort of saturate, its throughput would go down. We could go into that detail if you wanted. So Bob analyzed that and came up with the notion of binary exponential backoff to avoid this kind of collapse. But the difference between that observation and a piece of electronics that can fit in an alto and actually do networking, that was Boggs. Okay. So Boggs's mom was a counselor at American University, a college in Washington, D.C. And my mom went to Boggs's mom and said, find me an Ivy League school that has early decision. Okay. Figuring that she would be able to browbeat me into applying at least one place. Okay. And so Jane Boggs, Dave's mom, came up with Brown. So I applied to Brown. Dave swore that he would apply multiple places, regular decision. If he got into Brown, he would go. And then he stabbed me in the back by going to Princeton, for which I never forgave him.
Never forgive.
But yeah, and so there I am in Providence, Rhode Island, right? And after a few false starts, fell under the spell of this guy Andy Van Dam, who's now 85 years old and still teaching. This will not be me, but two other former students and I have a Zoom with him every Thursday night.
No kidding.
And he was actually out here last week, and I went mountain bike riding with him. So at age 85, he's still riding mountain bikes, although e-bikes.
Oh, that's awesome.
But, he's just a dear friend. And I think, your great students become family, right? And, I think I had a former PhD student from Taiwan and his wife and daughter and her husband over to dinner earlier this week. And, this is a guy who studied with me, graduated in 1990, right? So 30 plus years ago. And at the undergraduate level, like you, Paul, or the graduate level, like Jason Lynn, you keep in touch with these people forever, because all of us who are faculty learn far more from the students than they learn from us.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? I mean, that's the beauty. I get to constant exposure to a new crop of young people with fresh ideas. And it's an unbelievable privilege to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. Okay, so you get to Brown, and that professor you're talking about, was that a freshman year professor? Or
I actually had him the next year.
the next year?
Yeah.
Sophomore year. Okay.
Yeah, and then got engaged in research. He had a startup company, which of course tanked, but I worked for that one summer.
When there were people were doing startups back then.
Oh, sure.
I didn't know. My exposure to the startup community only started really when I graduated from college. So I don't know how business was run before I graduated.
Well, I expect there
it
were
VC?
VCs, and I don't know where his money came from, but he had several startups. The one I worked for was called Text Systems Incorporated, and he did Xerox PARC justifiably gets the credit, I think, but we were doing what you see is what you get hypertext editing in 1970.
Wow.
Okay, 69, 70 is I worked for him the summer of 1970. Okay, now we didn't have a bitmap display. Okay, so this was done on an IBM 2250 graphics display. Vector display, right? And the University Computer Center back then was an IBM 36050, which probably was about a 1 million instruction per second computer, filled an entire room, right? Yeah. And we basically used it as a PC between midnight and 8 in the morning, third shift, okay? And there was so we would go in the machine room, we were allowed in there and sit down at this graphics display and work on this hypertext editing system with a light pen that you would follow links. Obviously, there was no web. There was no, we didn't have the internet there. I mean, the internet first cropped up in 1969, okay, right about this time, but it didn't make it to Providence, Rhode Island at that point, okay? So the hypertext was all to other documents on the same computer, but nonetheless, it was the same sort of thing. You would put anchors on words, you would click them with a light pen, it would branch you off to another place in the document. You would build these hypertexts, and actually the year after I graduated, they taught an English literature course in which the students read, I think it was poetry, actually poems, and made links to comments and to other poems and stuff like that. So the students in this English course used this system to build a hypertext of poems and comments over the course of the semester. Right?
Oh, that's fun.
Anyway, so this is what we would do, and the computer was being used in the background. It was basically a batch machine. Okay, this is the days of batch computing, except for this hypertext editing, and this is not what computers were for. Okay, and we didn't have the money to pay for the enormous amounts of computing time we were consuming. But the way the OS 360 operating system worked was during the course of a shift, it would keep track of your consumption in a record in RAM, in memory. And at the end of the shift, the operator would run a shutdown procedure. And the shutdown procedure, among other things, would punch out accounting cards showing how much everybody had consumed that shift, okay? And then they'd be put in a card box, and at the end of the week or the end of the month, that would be processed and bills would be sent out. And we had a deal with the woman, her name I still remember, she was Grace, okay? And in return for making her daughter, the leading Girl Scout cookie salesperson in the state of Rhode Island.
There we go.
We were allowed to crash the system at the end of third shift and blow away the accounting records before she did the shutdown. Okay, so that's how we kept ourselves in business. Okay.
And so this were you writing software in what language?
Assembly language.
It's all assembly.
360 assembly language.
So
Yeah.
there's no C is not the thing.
No. And another project was building a systems programming language, a compiler at the time,
Okay.
called LSD, which stood for the Language for System Development, as I recall. And we eventually licensed it to some military outfit, and I think we changed the name to LSID or something like that in order to
Probably.
solve the procurement problem.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And there are other great, that was just such a great time. There was a big gang of us, and there was no computer science program. Brown, blessedly in 1969, just as I was arriving, introduced this thing called the new curriculum, which among other things allowed you to write your own major if you could find someone who was willing to sign off on it. Okay. So the title of my major was non-numerical computer science.
Wow.
And the point of that is that computers were for doing geophysics calculations and stuff like that. And the profligate waste of having a building-sized computer used as some guy's text editor. Yeah. Okay. This was just nonsense. Okay. Yeah. And so it was just largely unheard of. Obviously, Ivan Sutherland had done Sketchpad at that time, so people understood computer graphics, and there were beginning to be mini computers, but in general, what you had was these building-sized computers that ran geophysics jobs.
Wow. But if that's your degree, non-numerical computer science, it's called, but you're not supposed to, on the books, actually have access to the computer regularly. How were you supposed to be studying?
So how did you do it?
The answer is that the work we did, the academic aspect of this, my first 2 years, it moved to time sharing subsequently, okay? But the first 2 years was submitting punched card jobs.
Oh, batch jobs, yeah.
Batch jobs. Now the question is, what did you do with them? And we, for example, were doing some computational linguistics work in which there was a guy in the linguistics department who had built what for the time was a very large corpus. Okay. So, and I remember there was a guy named Hadge Ross, who was an MIT faculty member teaching a graduate course in the linguistics department that a friend and I took. And, it was all about transformational grammars. Okay. Sort of this notion of how you model language grammars. But we were building programs to do this. And what was very interesting was linguistics was undergoing a transformation back then in which previously, I think the principal criterion for getting into a graduate program in linguistics was you spoke multiple languages. Okay. And suddenly, like many fields, it was becoming more mathematical and more computational. This is back in the late 60s and early 70s. And a couple of computer science undergraduates could run circles around the linguistics grad students in this graduate linguistics course because we actually understood grammars and formal models and programming and stuff like that.
Every time they look at this stuff, it seems like it's amazing. It's amazing how much all the different human languages map onto each other in a bunch of different ways.
Sure.
Language is a pretty innate part of what makes humans humans, and so you can imagine that would make sense, but still it always seems like it's shocking to people, along the way. Mm-hmm. So you're doing honest to goodness, non-numerical computational analysis for linguistic models during the day, and then at night you're writing hypertext
text editing,
in assembly, and then crashing the logs at the end of the night.
Right, to make the accounting records go away. Yeah, but there were other things. I remember, it was sort of except for this. Third shift operator who was our friend Grace, you couldn't, for example, bring dogs into the machine room. This is a multi-million-dollar computer where that was real money. But there was a guy, Wolfgang Milbrandt, who had this not very attractive dog. And I still remember one night this dog took a dump on the machine room floor. And we didn't know what to do. So we just scooped it up on cars and put it in the trash can and headed off when the shift ended. I still remember all these names, not realizing that the computer center custodian, a guy named Tony, I forget his last name, had a side business selling cards to a recycler. So Tony put his big mitt in the trash can and came up with a handful of dog crap. Okay. And it was not a pretty time.
Wow.
Story.
We had the greatest time. And, we have reunions. I mentioned this faculty member, Andy Van Dam, is now 85 years old. But since he turned 60, every 5 years we have a reunion for him. And we all get back there. And he's been treating students the same. I guess he's cleaned up his act a little bit, but roughly the same for his entire this fall. It will be 60 years teaching at Brown. Okay. And so what's great is you have the same loyalty and the same feelings generation after generation after generation, and the same stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. He's a prodigious eater. You go out to a restaurant with him, particularly a Chinese restaurant, and you'll have dinner, and then he'll say, "Let's do that again." And he means to call the waiter over and have the same dishes come out again. Lindsay and I went to dinner with him here in Bellevue a couple of weeks ago when he was out here. And, it took me 3 days to recover from the amount of food we had to eat as he was just piling it down.
Oh, that's awesome.
So when you got to college, was that the first time you had hung out with other people who were also into computers? Was there a community around?
I wasn't into computers.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So, yeah, I think we all caught the bug at the same time.
Yeah. Cool. So you graduated.
I graduated.
Your bachelor's, your master's, or what'd you get?
Bachelor's, and we all did what Andy told us to do. Okay. And, he still is this unbelievably inspirational Pied Piper. So he would say, "You're going to grad school." My year, John Guttag and I were sent to the University of Toronto for grad school. Elaine Rich was sent to Carnegie Mellon for grad school. Claire Rabineau was sent to BBN to work. Okay. We just did whatever he told us to do. I didn't, apply to any other graduate schools. Andy just put the fix in. In fact, there was an event yesterday that I spent the day zooming into. It was a 75th birthday sort of honorable event for Guttag, who's a longtime professor at MIT, still teaching there. And he always, when a student graduates at their thesis defense, he digs out their statement of purpose from when they applied to the MIT graduate school and reads excerpts from it that he makes sure have nothing to do with what they actually wound up doing. That's how these things, serendipity is great. And so the grad student who was organizing this event called me because she was trying to get hold of his application to grad school at the University of Toronto. She was going to read to him. And I, of course, didn't have it. To my astonishment, the University of Toronto actually had this thing. They must have just warehouses full of paper, and they dug it up. And the report she got back was, well, they didn't have to have a statement of purpose back then. There was a one line where you entered what your intention was, but Professor Guttag left that blank. Okay, so the point here is we didn't take this very seriously. Andy just made sure we had great lives.
Right. Cool.
All right, and that was the case for all of us.
You said, Ed, you're going to get your master's. So he kind of prophesied that over you?
Yeah, I was clearly going to get a PhD, but at Toronto you had to have a master's to get a PhD. Right. So my friend John Guttag had gotten a master's at Brown.
Yep.
A story about him is very interesting. He was an undergraduate English major. Okay, just very bright, but an English major, right? And he was having a beer-fueled argument with one of his roommates in his junior year over who had the most challenging major. And they decided to settle this. So the bet was a case of beer, okay, that each of them would choose a no prerequisite course in the other's major for the other guy to take. And so Paul Knieven, John's roommate, chose an intro programming course for John, and John chose a Shakespeare course for Paul. And John thrived in the programming course, took a few more courses, stuck around and got a master's degree and then a PhD, and eventually became EECS department chair at MIT.
Wow.
His roommate, Paul, had to drop the Shakespeare course because he couldn't handle the load.
Yeah.
Okay? It was 2 plays and a written paper every week. And he just couldn't handle it. So the computer science major had to drop the Shakespeare course.
Wow.
And the English major thrived in the computer science course and went on to be a superstar computer scientist.
Oh, that's so cool. I love the serendipity of that. Okay, so and then he went to Toronto with you.
Yeah.
And got his PhD at the same time.
Yep.
Okay. And
Yep.
how'd you pick Toronto for your
I didn't.
PhD? You didn't. Okay.
Andy picked it.
Andy picked it, of course.
Yeah, he had a few schools he sent people to. He sent
Okay.
people to typically Toronto, Carnegie Mellon, and Stanford.
Okay.
Mostly to Toronto and Carnegie Mellon. So we just did what he said.
Wow.
I still do what he says. It's still like I'm 20.
Okay.
You know, it's just that, you know.
So you went to Toronto, got your master's in what? What was your master's?
Well, I was a computer science department.
Computer science was a thing by then?
Yeah. And it was not a thing at Brown for a number of years afterwards, but certainly computer science departments started cropping up in North America in the mid 1960s.
Wow, okay.
Okay.
Wow.
And in Canada, they were all led by numerical analysts. Okay, so Toronto, University of British Columbia these were old friends who mostly had worked around World War II at Chalk River, which was the Canadian nuclear research facility. Okay, so a whole bunch of computational scientists who'd been at Chalk River went off and started computer science programs. So they all had at the time a very heavy numerical analysis bent, which is less common in the U.S.
Yeah, sure. A lot of this, and was the primary motivator at that time nuclear research? Was it like why was that the link?
Well, I think I think the people who used computers, okay, were scientists doing numerical computation, and I think at some point you realized that you should actually think of computer science as a field of study, so they went off and formed academic departments.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so
It's so interesting because how many inventions eventually become their own major? You know, not that many, right? Nobody like majors in the loom or whatever, you know, like.
Well,
right?
they often say that if it's called a science, it isn't, right?
Yeah,
so
okay.
the joke is, you know, computer science is like washing machine science.
Okay.
And there's a bit of that, okay? I think so much of what we do is actually engineering. Certainly what you do is engineering.
Sure, yeah.
And my career has largely been engineering. There are people who do science. I mean, I think of computer science as having flowed from mathematics on one hand and electrical engineering on the other hand, and having initially a lot of applications. And if you go back to, for example, the writings of von Neumann back in the 1940s at the Institute for Advanced Study, he foresaw all of these applications. Okay, so he understood. You know, he talked about weather forecasting, for example, things like that. I mean, that's interesting. You know, artificial intelligence is all the buzz these days,
Sure.
and the phrase was coined in 1955 in a proposal for a Dartmouth summer research study on artificial intelligence. And this was the proposal was written by 4 people, including Marvin Minsky, for example, who's very well known. And it again laid out all of the problems, okay, so reasoning and things like that. And the mistake was, it said, and I think a fair amount of progress can be made in a number of these problems if the right group of people get together for the summer.
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
so that turned out to be optimistic by at least 70 years, but it's just very interesting because they understood what all the problems were, or what all the challenges were, just like von Neumann understood the many numerical applications. Obviously, what he was really doing was ballistic calculations.
Sure, yeah.
And that goes back a long way. If you look at Babbage's machines, right? They were for calculating trajectories of cannonballs and stuff like that. You know, they were difference engines.
Yeah.
Have you seen you must have the remake of Babbage's difference engine too?
Where?
Well, Nathan Myhrvold has one here that used to be at the Computer History Museum, and the story here is the machine was never actually built. Okay, and the reason was it was a defense project in the 1800s, and it ran over budget. And back then, defense projects that ran over budget got canceled. Okay, so it never got finished. Okay, but the plans existed, and the British Museum wanted to know if the plans were correct. That is, would this thing actually work if you implemented it? So they set about to use 19th century machine tools to have to build from Babbage's plans this machine, and once again it ran over budget. Okay, and they unlike today's military, didn't have a pot to dip into. So as I understand it, they went to Bill Gates and said, "Would you fund this?" And he said, "Well, no, I won't, but my friend Nathan Myhrvold does all sorts of crackpot things. Why don't you talk to him?" And Nathan agreed to fund the completion of the machine if they would build a second one for him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay, so they did that, and Nathan loaned it for a number of years to the Computer History Museum, and the difference engine had 8,000 parts, and the printer had another 8,000 parts. These are all little brass gears. Okay, and it operated. It was intended to be powered by a steam engine, and in fact operated by turning a crank.
Oh, wow.
Okay? And it had a drip pan underneath. Okay, as you turned the crank, oil would sort of ooze out of the thing. And there was one person at the Computer History Museum who was allowed to turn the crank, because if you went, too fast or too slow or not steady, you could sort of jam the gears.
Yeah,
a big treat was we had a birthday party for Ivan Sutherland, the godfather of computer graphics. I think it was his 70th birthday a number of years ago, and they actually let Ivan turn the crank. We had the birthday party at the Computer History Museum. As far as I know, Ivan is the only person, aside from this one designated guy, who's ever been allowed to actually crank the what is now Nathan's difference engine.
Well, because that was originally invented and conceived of when steam power was becoming a force in England, right? That was what you expected every piece of automated equipment to do, is run on steam.
And what I've read is that's the one part that wouldn't have worked. Okay,
Yeah.
and the reason is that the power required depended a lot on where you were in evaluating the polynomial as you turned the crank. Okay, so it took much more force at some times than others, and if you exerted too much force, it would break. Too little force, and it wouldn't move. Okay, so it turned out in retrospect, having built the machine, and his plans did work perfectly. Okay, having built the machine, that I hope I'm getting this roughly right, that the steam power would not have worked.
Wow.
So there's an interesting, we're going all over the map here, story about steam power. A colleague of mine at UW many years ago, she was a software engineering faculty member, and she did a study of the introduction of high-pressure steam power in England and the United States. So original steam power was low pressure, but high-pressure steam offered much more power, okay? And it was more dangerous. You could have boiler explosions and stuff like that, okay? And the British had much stricter safety regulations than the United States did at the time. And as a result, we had a greater number of boiler explosions, okay, and loss of life, but a much more rapid and forceful steam-powered industrial revolution, okay? So there is a trade-off between safety and progress, I guess I would say, okay? And a really important public policy issue is, where do you set that slider? Okay. And, I think it's fair to say that the Chinese, for example, are going to have unfettered ability to experiment with autonomous vehicles. Okay. And in the U.S., we're not going to. Right. And so there are a set of debugging runs that the Chinese will benefit from that we don't benefit from. And I think that's, from the point of view of the premium we place on human life in this country, that's entirely appropriate. It's consistent with our values. Okay.
That's true.
But if one believes the analogy of high pressure steam, it means that the Chinese are going to make faster progress toward true level 5 autonomy than we are.
You could say that about many things. Autonomy, you can say that about AI, right? There's certainly a level of, I get concerned when I hear senators talking about trying to pass laws to, for AI systems, because I can understand the motivation, but you ask them, what are you proposing? What are you proposing? And are you going to limit the number of GPU hours? What's the plan? What is the plan? Right. So it's weird. So that and I think there's same thing happened with space exploration, and the Soviets were way more laissez-faire about life and right. And they made rapid progress, and it wasn't until the United States and and JFK's speech, right, about the race to the moon and all that the United States really started going, but there was loss of life, there was a lot of danger there, right?
So we had this similar issue with synthetic biology in this country, and it is, like many technologies, a force for good and can be used for negative purposes. Right. And again, we need to make progress in synthetic biology because that's where we get vaccines, for example. And that's where we get new enzyme catalysts and all sorts of things like that. And it's also where we get it can be used to produce diseases, okay? But it can also be used to produce the vaccines that inoculate you against those diseases. So, you need to do the research, and at the same time, you need to, at the very least, I think, regulate the uses to which the results can be put.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. But that's different. What you don't want to do is stop the research.
Right.
Okay. There may be some forms of research on humans or something like that you really want to put a stop to. Again, because of values. But in general, you got to push the research forward, and you have to limit how the results can be used.
Sure.
Consistent with your values as a person and as a country.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you graduate from Toronto, and then where'd you go?
I interviewed for jobs and wound up at the University of Washington.
Oh, you didn't. But what about your PhD?
I got my PhD at Toronto.
Oh, you did?
So,
Yeah,
I stayed for a PhD. Got a master's and a PhD from the same advisor.
Do you remember your thesis?
Yeah, I was doing performance modeling of computer systems. Okay?
Oh, wow.
So, and again, these were mainframe systems. They may have been time-sharing systems, okay, but they were big mainframes. And the question was, did you need more memory? Did you need a faster processor? Did you need more disk drives? How was your workload growing? This sort of stuff. Okay, it was called capacity planning, right? And traditionally, this was done by simulation models, which were computationally very expensive. And a set of techniques were developed to solve these similar models analytically. Okay. And in order to do the analysis, you had to make a set of simplifying assumptions. And so there was, as you would expect, this big battle between the simulation models, which were in principle more accurate because they didn't make all these assumptions, okay, but as a practical matter were ridiculously computationally expensive. And these analytic models, which were quick, but made a set of approximations, okay. Now, ultimately, the analytic models won out. And that's what I was working on, okay. And the reason is that in projecting what your workload was going to be a year from now, you were just making stuff up.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the discrepancy in your workload forecast was far greater than the accuracy difference between a simulation model and an analytic model. Okay, so the analytic models were perfectly synergistic with other uncertainties in the process, and they gave you the ability to interactively ask what-if questions. What if I made this change? What if I made that change? What if the workload grew twice as fast? This sort of stuff, okay? And whenever you turn something from batch, which simulation was, into interactive, it changes your way of thinking. Okay, you can suddenly ask these what-if questions as fast as you can think of them.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the cool thing about interactive computing in general and interactive problem solving.
Yeah.
Okay, it's your ability to do what if.
Sure. Wow.
Is just incredibly powerful.
So, and so your thesis, you studied some workloads and then did this.
Well, I was working on a particular aspect of representing the particular type of approximation for a particular aspect of these analytic models. And then I continued doing that for a few years here and did a startup company back in the early 1980s with my thesis advisor from Toronto. And
this is during your PhD?
No, this was just afterwards. Okay, I moved down here. We wrote in 1984, we published what was sort of the definitive book on analytic modeling
Wow.
for capacity planning. And we did a startup company with a tool that a book is long since out of print. Okay. And we had this tool, and the company lasted for 20 years. It was never that successful, but it bought each of the three of us houses and put our kids through college. So it was, it was okay. It wasn't, Isilon, but it was great. And then what happened was, I was trying to do this as a faculty member at the University of Washington, and all the work, of course, gets done by students, and grad students at UW. Why did I choose modeling? Well, I really liked my thesis advisor. I had met him when I visited there to check the place out when I was still a senior undergraduate, and that's what he was doing. But also, it was a fairly efficient way to get a PhD as opposed to building something. Which takes a lot of time. Okay, so it was a way out the door. Okay, and so I did that when I arrived here, but it's not something that students really wanted to do. Okay, they wanted to build stuff. So as a faculty member, every 7th year you get a sabbatical to go off somewhere and learn something new. In my case, I went back and repotted into something old. I went back to doing systems programming work. Okay, and then had a very successful next period of time at the University of Washington with a bunch of great students building stuff. Okay, and that was where I went was a place called, there was a company once upon a time called the Digital Equipment Corporation. Right? And DEC had a thing in Palo Alto, California called the Systems Research Center. And this was the first year of the Systems Research Center because all these folks Bob Taylor, who ran it, had run the computer systems lab at Xerox PARC, and he got fired by the Xerox Corporation in one of their many big blunders.
Wow.
So everybody...
For wasting all their money inventing the future of computing.
Exactly, okay. Well, Bob, like many phenomenal people, Bob was not easy to manage. Okay, and he shouldn't have been managed. He should have been let loose to manage the people below him because they were just doing extraordinary stuff. But he had a guy who wanted to manage him, and he was let go. And of course, everybody left with him. And they, by and large, moved to the DEC Systems Research Center.
Wow.
And the story there was I knew for my sabbatical I wanted to repot myself back in an active programming business. And I had planned to spend the year with Barbara Liskov at MIT, who's just a phenomenal winner of the Turing Award years later, now recently retired top person. And I thought I had been keeping my wife, Lindsay, informed about this. But finally, it's like January, and I'm about to sign the deal to go to Boston in the summer to be at MIT for a year with Barbara. And I said to Lindsay, okay, I'm about to sign on the bottom line. She says, I grew up in Toronto. I'm not spending a year in Boston. Oh, wow. So I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? Okay, so I had to explain to Barbara that we weren't going. And then I had to find something to do. But a person on my thesis committee at Toronto had moved to Xerox PARC and then had moved to DEC Circ. With Taylor, a gentleman named Jim Horning, who actually was Guttag's thesis advisor. So all this ties back to John Guttag. Okay, and the phone rang, and it was Jim Horning saying they just started this new lab and they were looking for visitors. Did I want to come there the next year? So I became the first sabbatical visitor at DEC Circ.
Wow.
Okay, so it all worked out, and they were building a machine called the Firefly, which was a personal workstation that was a multiprocessor. It had 5 microvaxes in it.
Wow.
Okay, and this was these folks who had just invented the future with Altos and bitmap displays were now building a new machine, but the tool they used to build it was VAX 780s with VT100 character displays. Okay, so it was quite a blast backwards for them. But anyway, this is a phenomenal year. So I built the remote procedure call system for the Firefly under the tutelage of Andrew Birrell, a wonderful person. And then,
the RPC was to talk to the different processors? Is that what you're saying? Or what was it for?
Well, the RPC both talked internally, but of course that's also what we use to talk between machines.
Yeah, okay.
It was
because the operating system, I imagine, was not SMP aware, right? It didn't know about multiple processors. That must have been part of your work to make it.
Yeah, that was part of somebody else's work. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But we used the same RPC system essentially as part of the remote procedure call.
Right. It's so funny because you go from you go from a single processor to two, and in that step, it takes a lot of work to get two of them operating at the same overall output as the single one was. Because suddenly you've got locking and you've got synchronization, right? And it's
So obviously, first of all, the operating system had to deal with these synchronization issues. Most of the applications ran on a single processor and used a local version of remote procedure call to talk to one another. So the file system was a process running on a processor, right? And your application was running on a processor. And when it wanted to invoke the file system, it would do an RPC call to the file system. Okay. And the RPC system, remote procedure call system, would handle transparently both calls to different address spaces on the same machine and calls between machines. Okay. Obviously using a much heavier overhead reliable protocol to go between machines. But again, that's an important thing. While the interface was the same, the actual protocol go between address spaces on the same machine did not have a bunch of error checking blah blah in it that you needed to go between machines on the same local area network, which again had sacrificed a certain amount of error checking blah blah that you needed to go between buildings across the internet.
Yeah.
Right. And the folks at DEC were kind enough to send me back to the University of Washington with 5 of these Fireflies. And that made our grad students sort of the kingpins of multiprocessing for a number of years.
Premier facility, right?
Yeah, it was phenomenal to have these things because we were using them to sort of explore how to get reasonable performance out of thread systems running on multiprocessors.
Wow. So interesting.
Threads are, of course, sort of lightweight pseudo processes that.
What year was this?
This was 1981.
Wow.
Something like that.
1981. I had not yet.
Do I have that right? No, it's a little later than that. Sorry, it was 1984.
Okay, 84 was, I had just saved up my paper route money enough to buy my first floppy disk drive for my Commodore 64. I think that would have been right around 1984.
That's awesome.
And I was spending all day writing software. My mother telling me it's not good to be sitting in front of that computer for so long like that, which is now it's a job, right? Now people do it all the time. At the time, she thought it was insane that some kid would just sit there and stare at this thing all day,
there's this quip that people always make, which is, what if automobiles had been on the same progress trajectory as computers over the past 15 or 20 years, right? And it's astonishing what has actually happened, how much smaller and faster and less expensive things have got. So I forget what the numbers are, but, a car would be, a couple inches long and would travel so many million miles an hour and go cross country on a thimbleful of gas. And,
that cost right there would outdo my Commodore 64 1,000 times over, right?
Right.
Good point.
We throw stuff away that back 20 years ago would have been, some alien civilization.
I wish I'd saved some of that stuff. Chuck Thacker, now passed away, was the guy building the Firefly workstations at DEC. Chuck built the Alto years before. Okay, so and now I forgot where I was going with that. Oh yeah, I had come down there. It was 1984. And I got a colleague and I, John Zahorian and I, each got sort of first generation Macs with 128K of memory.
Oh yeah,
right. I think a 300K floppy drive, if I remember. I forget how big it was. It was tiny. Okay, and I had a wiring diagram to upgrade the Mac from 128 to 512K of memory. And Chuck Thacker agreed to do that for me, okay, assuming that he was allowed to take it apart in front of people. Okay, but I wish I had saved that Mac because it was upgraded to 512K by the great Chuck Thacker. When he took this thing apart, and you remember these Macs had a very long cavern in which you had to get to the screws to undo the cabinet. Okay, so he had to get a screwdriver with a long schnoz, and he took the screws out and took this thing apart. And then he's in front of 20 of us. We're watching him do this. He's counting things in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I assumed he was like counting integrated circuits, and he was in fact counting screws. Okay, and here's the reason: Japanese electronic products were vastly easier to assemble than American electronic products. products. And among other things, they had far fewer screws.
Huh.
Okay. And he said the Mac was twice as good as any American electronic product he'd ever seen in terms of the number of screws required, but off by a factor of 2 from the best Japanese devices.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the first thing he did was count the screws.
Wow.
That's a fun story.
To see, understand the manufacturing process.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. There's a lot that goes into it, putting it together. Design for manufacturing is as important as design for functionality, and this is
100%.
this is a lesson everybody learns when they get into physical machines at one time or another.
Another great story Chuck told was he knew several years in advance how to build the Alto, and it just had to be plausible in terms of cost. Okay. So, and it needed a certain amount of memory for the bitmap display and a certain amount of memory for programs. And I forget what those numbers were, but we're talking, probably hundreds of K, not megabytes. Okay. But he had a plot at which point the cost of the memory would be less than half the cost of the machine. And a month in advance of that prediction, okay, because we all know how Moore's law works, okay, he started the final design of the thing, okay, so that he would be ready to actually build it by the time the cost of memory had come down so that he could afford to build the machine.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay, so given more money, he could have built it years earlier.
Sure.
He knew exactly how to do it. He just realized that, there's a limit to what you could pay for the amount of memory you needed.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Well, that's cool.
That is cool. Okay, Ed, so I'm curious. So backing up a little bit. So your PhD experience, then you're about to graduate from your PhD. Yeah, how'd you decide? Like, okay, going into teaching versus...
Yeah, that's a good question.
Startup? Yeah.
I had really loved my time in university and in grad school. And, my grad advisor suggested I look for university jobs. And how'd I wind up at UW? I don't know. In the end, I was choosing between 2 UWs, between Wisconsin and Washington.
Oh, no kidding.
Okay. And they were both really good universities and decent computer science departments in places with lots of trees. And what's really interesting is what's happened to Seattle in that period of time and what hasn't happened to Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I moved here, Microsoft was 12 people in Albuquerque. That was 1977. Okay. And tech here was like Boeing building planes and Fluke building voltmeters and Physio-Control building defibrillators.
Sure.
Okay. So there's no tech as we think of tech.
Right.
These days.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean,
That was they had the famous freeway sign about the last one out.
that was a little before that. That was early 1970s. Yeah. Okay. But it's astonishing what's happened to Seattle. And again, not all of it has been positive, but the vast majority has been positive, right? As a city and as a community, look, we have a lot of work to do, but we are far better off than we were in
Absolutely.
the 1970s. And here's the bad news, just to get on a hobby horse of mine, okay? By and large, you're an exception, Paul, but by and large, the tech industry here has been built by people who moved here from elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's because our education system does not prepare our kids for these jobs. Okay. And, we have among the lowest rates of four-year college participation per capita in the country.
Yep.
And we do not have by any measure a successful K-12 system. We haven't had it for years and years and years. And, I think as a community, as a state, we have to commit to our kids getting the education that allows them to be first-class participants in this innovation economy we're creating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not just a tech commodity; it's a economy. It's a bioeconomy, and it's a high-end business economy, and of course, it's also art and music and retail. But more and more, it's innovative, and more requires an education that we don't give our kids here.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's a tragedy that I've been whining about for decades. And we are so insistent on feeling good about ourselves that we, to get political here, don't understand that we have one of the most regressive tax systems in the country, for example, and that Massachusetts has a K-12 system that puts ours to shame. and that we have a very low four-year college participation rate. Okay, and these are things we should know about and care about. And I think the tech community, I for many years was on the board of the Washington Tech Industry Association, and I think it has, if I scroll back 20 years, they were I'm going to say a standard trade association whose goal was to keep taxes down, because they were funded by a bunch of people who had to make payroll in the next quarter, right? And they now have an honest-to-God policy agenda that recognizes that it's our job as tech people to make sure we exist in a thriving community. Okay, and that means a thriving community for everybody, not just us. That's just really important for people to realize that.
I do think, I got, just to relate to that a little bit, I had a terrible time in K through 12. I got kicked out of school several times. And when I got accepted to the University of Washington Computer Science Department, your department accepted me based on my grades at Bellevue Community College, which is what it was called at the time. So I never took the SATs. I just went directly to whoever was at your office, and that lady told me, and I was working on my AA degree, and the lady there told me, well, with these grades, you could probably get in next quarter. And I was like, really? So I applied, I got in, and then at the last minute, they put the brakes on. I got a note from the University of Washington, the greater school, that there was actually a problem because I technically had never graduated from high school, and my missing component was the foreign language requirement. So that's why I took.
No kidding.
That's why I took summer intensive Swedish at the UW.
What a great story!
Yeah,
Before you started.
6 hours a day of Swedish, and then I'd go work at UPS loading trailers all night, come back and do Swedish in the morning. That's how
What a great story!
Topped off my recs. But it was like the K through 12 was, for me in a public school, I didn't know anything about college. I didn't know I had the access or the ability to go to college. It was not something that was discussed. That came up, right? High school was about,
right.
I went to several different high schools, and they were about football and sports.
Yep.
Right. I was a nerd because I liked math, and there was no benefit to having that skill.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got to college that it was like, oh, this is cool, about computers. Right. Not an experience I'd ever had in the K through 12. I think it's a real travesty. Hopefully that's changed now because people know about tech startups, but still, our public schools are a disaster. I mean, it is not good.
So here's a college admission story you'll resonate with. Rob Short?
Yes.
Okay, many years at Microsoft and at DEC before then.
Yeah.
Rob is long retired. He was corporate VP for Windows internals at Microsoft for many years. Okay, moved over there with Cutler, basically. Yeah. So he moved from DEC East to DEC West Engineering when Cutler moved out here to found DEC West Engineering, and then moved with the Cutler group to Microsoft.
To make Microsoft's first
Windows
real
NT.
operating system.
Windows NT, yeah. Okay, all right. So the story with Rob is he wanted to get a master's degree from us in computer science, working with Hank Levy, who you know very well. Okay, and so he applied to UW, and we of course were thrilled. We knew Rob very well. It was going to be, another of these situations where he teaches us more than we teach him. Mm. But Rob didn't have a college degree. He had a 2-year degree from a tech school in Ireland. Okay, so he began as a technician at a DEC plant in Ireland, and eventually became a digital designer because some computer designer in Ireland realized that Rob had more intuition for computer design than most of the computer designers. Okay. Anyway, this was no problem with us, but the UW graduate school, or as we refer to it, the graduate school, decided that he couldn't be admitted to the University of Washington. This is your story, because he didn't have a 4-year college degree. Mm. In that case, Hank and I had a word with the graduate school, and they were willing to accommodate Rob. But it's another similar story of this incredibly bright guy who lacks a credential.
Lacks the credential, yeah.
Was involved originally with an outfit in Seattle called the Ada Developers Academy. Uh-huh. Okay, and
sure.
Ada was spawned originally out of the Technology Alliance. I was on the board there, and the idea was it was focused largely on young women who had a degree in something often other than computing, okay, and would give them effectively a front end, Ruby on Rails boot camp and a guaranteed internship. And the more progressive Seattle companies, Zillow's of the world and Microsoft, signed up to do this tech, and now I've forgotten why I started telling this story. What were we talking about? It's
We're talking about Rob Short. We're talking about
Yeah.
about not having the credentials.
Yeah. It's that a number of people with a tech background sign up for ADA, but don't bother with the boot camp aspect because they actually have the skills, but they don't have the credential that will get them an interview. Okay, and so what ADA does is get them a guaranteed internship with a tech company. Of course, they flourish at that internship because they had the skills. They just didn't have the piece of paper that was going to get them interviewed so they could demonstrate the skills.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So ADA gets them an internship at which they excel, and then they get a permanent job.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
There's this precipitous drop off in female participation in computing that happened somewhere in K through 12, where the male and female lines track until a certain point, and then there's this huge divergence, and it's like in ninth grade or seventh grade, somewhere around there, that they've been tracking this for a long time.
We're recovering from this now, but I think it has been a tough slog. You can attribute it to many things. I think video games played a role. Okay, they became a guy thing.
Yeah.
Okay, and that meant that guys had a familiarity that was misconstrued as an actual advantage.
Yeah, I can see that.
And so that was intimidating to people who didn't have that background.
Yeah.
And the fact is that playing video games didn't give you a lot of competitive advantage in actually being a computer scientist.
Certainly not. Yeah.
Okay. But it was intimidating and off-putting.
Yeah.
And that then caused the industry to become a bro palace.
Sure.
Okay.
Once that happens.
So it was not a good place to work either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so the challenge is recovering from that, and it's a long road, and it's a longer road in this state than in others because Initiative 200 prevents any form of affirmative action based on race or gender. So Prop 209 in California is the same thing. So we in California for many years have been dealing under the same restrictions that the Supreme Court has just placed on the country as a whole. So the good news is we've figured out various ways to compensate. In the case of women, it's all about recruiting, okay?
Yeah,
because admission to the university, admission to the computer science program is absolutely level playing field. When someone, every once in a while on our undergrad B board, some bro will assert that women are in the program because we cut them some slack on admissions. And the answer is that's against the law. We don't do that, but we recruit our tails off. Okay?
I mean, it's obviously healthy for everybody. It's healthy for, as a sort of social thing, but it's also healthy just to get the number of people in the candidate pool for these jobs up, right? We tap out the H-1B system every single year, hire as many H-1Bs as we can, and it's not because we pay them less. It's because a lot of them come from a culture where engineering is respected,
right?
Yeah,
and it's their own way out. One of my favorite guys to work with was this Indian guy at Uber, who he told me. I talked to him about motivation and his childhood and stuff. He was either going to become a computer scientist and get to the United States, or he was going to be a goat farmer. That's a hell of a motivation, right? And but we don't need to go to that extreme, but we do need to make these options available to people.
So there's another reason, so you pointed out there's a workforce issue, right? For sure. There's a sort of social equity reason. Yeah. It's also the case that diverse teams produce better outcomes. Yeah. Okay? And that's because each of us brings our own background to anything that we do. And if there are perspectives that are unrepresented or underrepresented, then there are solutions and problems that aren't considered.
Sure.
All right? And it's important in any system that you build for humans to use, whether it's a car or a piece of software. The more perspectives that are represented, Okay. And this is not a reason to choose people of lesser capabilities because they have a different perspective. It's to realize that excellence is a quantity with many dimensions, right? Sure. And you have some characteristics of excellence that I lack, and so do you. Okay. And I may have some that you lack, and together we can get more done than any of us could do individually. And it's not just a matter of how many hours a day we have to work. It's a matter of the perspectives that we bring to the to solving the problem that we're confronted with. Yeah. So there are just all kinds of reasons that even if you're just a crass capitalist who wants to sell more stuff, you ought to care about diversity.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was really excited to ask you about this because I wanted to hear about your time on the Committee of Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine too. Because how long were you involved with that? Are you still involved with that?
You're only allowed to do 2 3-year terms. I wound up doing 7 years. This is a National Academies Committee that looks at women in science and engineering and medicine.
Yeah.
And the way these standing committees are constantly sort of looking at problems, and what they do then is spawn study committees that look at particular issues in detail. Okay, so I and another person, a faculty member at Berkeley, got farmed out from the Committee on Women to work for 2 years on a study committee on the impact of sexual harassment in academia. And that has had a pretty significant effect. And not surprisingly, there's every bit as much harassment in academia as anywhere else, right? And some of it is overt and some of it is subtle. And it was very important to draw attention to the extent to which it really is pervasive. And again, the argument is that harassment in education and harassment in the workforce, to Paul's point, is depriving us of a set of people who could otherwise be making remarkable contributions. They leave the field, okay? And they leave the field in some cases after we've invested years and years of our dollars educating them, okay? And they're just about to be able to be hugely productive, and they exit because of the way they're treated.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, even if you didn't care about the lives of these people and, how they felt at work, if you just wanted to get the maximum output from America's science and engineering workforce, you've got to deal with this harassment in academia and industry.
Yeah.
And, I think in academia, there's a long history of what we call pass the trash. Okay, and pass the trash is there's typically a guy who is harassing typically a woman, and to avoid the personnel hassle of piping that person overboard, we give them a great recommendation and send them on to their next job, where they do the same thing again.
Yeah.
Okay. And I have to say the University of Washington, not in computer science, but as a university as a whole, has been both a victim and a perpetrator of pass the trash. And this has got to stop. I think under Anna-Maria Kause, it has stopped. Okay. But, this is a game that people play for, if you scroll back long enough, it was something that was just tolerated. Okay. You didn't worry about passing the trash. Okay. When it became something you couldn't tolerate, then for many years you quietly passed the trash to avoid the HR overhead of piping somebody overboard.
Yeah.
And, it's challenging because at universities, in contrast to industry, people don't serve at will. Okay. And, there were a set of industry folks on this sexual harassment study committee, and they were astonished to learn about the behavior of universities. Okay. Because if you're working for a major company that's cognizant of these issues and you transgress, you are gone.
Yeah, sure.
Okay? No questions asked.
Yeah.
Okay. And, it's more of a process in academia.
Interesting. So with this committee, what was kind of the end outcome in terms of implementing the findings or sharing the findings? Would you?
Well, the outcome of this was to, I'm going to say something that sounds like academic babble, but the Academy's created a thing called an Action Collaborative, which got, I believe, 60 universities to sign up to actually make changes. That includes the University of Washington.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very cool.
And so, and they sort of meet and share strategies and share what they're doing, and are held accountable to make progress. And, accountability is tremendously important if you're going to make progress on these things. So
That's really good. Yeah.
And there also there are a set of behaviors that are not technically harassment, and that therefore we didn't address them. Okay, so for example, anybody who's run an academic department knows that there is someone, if not in your department, in some other department, who successively grooms a succession of young women, okay, for affairs. Okay, but these are ostensibly consensual because none of them knew that they were the eighth in a series, and that this was really okay. So because it's ostensibly consensual, it's not harassment. Okay, but it is deplorable, and it has to not be tolerated.
Problematic. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the engineers on this study committee and the people from business wanted this addressed. Okay, and a set of other people and there were a set of scholars of harassment on there, and they insisted that we stick just to stuff that was actually harassment. And I think that turned out to be right, because had the report been too strident, it would have been more likely to be ignored by people. Okay, so I think in retrospect, we struck a reasonable balance of convincing people there was a problem without tackling the full breadth and depth of the problem, which might have been caused reluctance on the part of some people. Here's another example. Okay, Stanford has a hard and fast rule against any kind of personal relationships between faculty and students. Okay, and to me that sounds perfectly reasonable. Okay, on the other hand, a public university like the University of Washington has many returning undergraduates, for example, who are in their 30s and 40s. Okay, and faculty member meets returning undergraduate in a bar, and they, and that person is an entirely different part of the university.
Right.
But so it's more complicated than it seemed to me on the surface. Okay, I admit that it's complicated. Now, from my point of view, there is you can't do it. Period. It's a firing offense, and it has to be disclosed, and we'll evaluate. Okay, and situations like I've just described, it seems to me clearly have to be disclosed, but maybe they're not a termination offense at a big public university with a wide age range among its students. But Stanford, I have to say, has on its website a graphic, a PDF graphic that says, the following three things are simply forbidden, and if you do it, you're gone like a goose. Okay, and the following three things have to be disclosed, and this is. It is so simple that even a faculty member can understand it, okay? As opposed to the many pages of faculty code in which this sort of stuff is normally embedded. So I really admire this graphics, which says, absolutely not, and you have to disclose. And I say it's so simple, even a faculty member can understand what he or she can't do.
Totally. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, yeah, so that committee is interesting. And I know you've obviously had a number of board seats too. So you talked about the WTIA. When did you join the AI2 board? You've been on that for a while as well.
At its inception, so that's now 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Let me say one more thing about gender diversity. Is something we've focused on for a long time in our department at the University of Washington. And we are not doing well, but we're doing about twice as well as our peers. Okay, so our peers are undergraduate programs at departments that also grant the PhD. Okay, and again, importantly, it has to be done in the presence of a complete level playing field in terms of admission. Okay. On the other hand, we can do things like do outreach to sororities. We can reach out to high performing students in the introductory course, particularly young women, and say, you're good at this. Okay, and that's important because, I think there are a set of people, women, traditionally underrepresented minorities, marginalized people who are susceptible to imposter syndrome. And, white males typically aren't. Okay, a white male gets 7 out of 10 on a test. He says, man, I'm really good at this. A woman gets a 7 out of 10 on a test. She says, oh my God, this is not for me. Okay, it's the same score, right?
It's true.
So
definitely seen that behavior a lot.
Yeah. So reaching out to people and saying, you're actually good at this, it makes an enormous difference. And it's the sort of thing you have to do. I mean, we have to make sure we have to try as hard as we can to have a climate in the Allen School that's supportive of everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, the best sort of affirmative action is affirmative action that helps everybody. It may help traditionally marginalized people disproportionately, but it makes things better for everyone. Okay. And a climate that is free of belittlement and harassment, and we're by no means free of that, but that sends the message that it's not tolerated, creates a better environment for everybody.
Absolutely.
And so that's the sort of stuff that we try to do. And we now, as of last year, also had a higher percentage of Black students, of first-generation students, and of Pell-eligible students than the University of Washington, Seattle as a whole.
Which
is pretty unusual for a
Pell?
computer science department. Sorry?
What's a Pell? What's a Pell grant?
Yeah, Pell is the federal program that provides grants for students whose families don't have a lot of financial resources. Okay, so it's a measure of economic.
That's how I got. That's how I got my first.
There you go. Right, Pells are fantastic.
Yeah.
Right, and again, the threshold for Pell is just a easy definition of somebody who doesn't have significant financial resources.
Yeah.
Okay, so
but it's one of those things that. How would you even know?
Right.
How would you even know that's available to you?
Yeah.
The way I found out was the person in your office said, you can get in. And I said, great, I can't pay for this. And then she said, here's some paperwork. There's this thing called the Pell grant you can get. And I got it. But how would I have ever known that if I just hadn't one day taken the bus downtown? You know what I mean? It's not
exactly. Well,
the fact that you even knew to go into it.
I have no idea what I was doing.
So UW also has this thing called the Husky Promise. Okay, and the Husky Promise says if your family income is below a certain level, it's free. Okay, students don't know that. Okay, so there are students who believe they can't afford to go to the University of Washington or to any college in the state. And I think other schools and colleges in the state have similar programs, but they just don't understand this program exists, and therefore they think it's unattainable for them and their families.
Yeah.
And in fact, UW and the state put enormous resources into making it possible for people of.
Is there some way to, have a program in the high schools? Or,
just got to keep getting the word out.
Yeah.
But again, I think we're doing better than when you were contemplating
maybe so
this, but there's a long way still to go. Similarly, we are constantly telling high school counselors that even in this day and age, you don't have to have taken a programming course in high school to become a computer science major.
That's for sure. I know people who started in their 30s. Do great.
We have people on our faculty who are a lot younger than me who did not do any computer science until they went to college.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
it sounds like when you're in that state, it sounds like it's too late, right? When you're 19, everybody around you's been programming for 5 years or whatever. You think you're way behind.
That's the intimidation thing.
What you don't know is in 6 years you're all in the same place. Right. What you don't know is after you get your first job, nobody cares where you went to school, what your grades were.
Yep.
Right. What happened in high school, what your SAT. Nobody cares. 2 years into your career, nobody cares at all. Just getting into that first thing.
I had to, actually, I didn't, but one of our student advisors had to get a copy of my grad school transcript at one point because we were running a summer program for high school teachers, a summer program in computer science for high school teachers of math and science, not computer science. And they get professional education credits for this, but those credits are granted by a community college. And the community college needed to see my grad school transcript before they would allow me to grant their credits to the high school teachers.
Wow.
So I have never seen my grad school transcript, and certainly the University of Washington has it. But the academic advisor who was coordinating this summer program got my grad school transcript from the University of Toronto.
I'm surprised they even have it. I wonder if the UW has mine, for my, right? Who knows?
sure.
Would they? I don't know. Maybe
Probably.
not.
Well, it was probably electronic in your days,
Maybe.
not in mine.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was very funny. So that's the only, to your point, that's the only person who's ever looked at my graduate school grades are this person at a community college, so that I could grant summer credits to high school teachers.
You get a bad grade in college in some course you really care about, and you feel like you're a dunce and your career's over.
Well, I had plenty.
It's so true.
I got a D in physics. I got a C in differential equations. I lived to tell the tale.
Yeah.
I found something I loved and was good at.
Yeah, that's all it takes.
Yeah, no, it's real. It's overcoming that imposter syndrome, or like you said,
Sure.
for everybody.
All I cared about in school was math. All I liked was math and computer. There's no computer classes, and my final year at one of the high schools before they kicked me out was I went to the math class twice, to take the midterm and to take the final, and I got 100 on both things, and then they wound up kicking me out of school because those are the only 2 days I went to that class.
It was definitely attendance, wasn't it, Paul?
Well, I was like, give me a book, I'll learn what I need to learn, leave me alone.
Yeah.
I do think that our public K through 12 also turns into too much of a babysitting thing, where it's like, hey, instead of having this kid go read in a comfortable location and learn, we make them sit at a desk with whatever it is, 200 other people, and have the teacher talk at them, and it's like, well, the information's in the book. I mean, at least in the sciences,
Well,
it's in
just
the
recognizing,
book.
your
And I want to be clear that I am not blaming the teachers at all. Okay?
You can't blame the teachers.
Particularly, I have a son who's an 8th grade math teacher. Okay, so I have a feeling for how challenging that job is and how great these teachers do. But as a citizenry, we need to insist on a better K-12 system.
Is it part of the problem? Is it Common Core? Is that part of the issue?
I'm not an expert. I can't purport to say what the problem is.
Yeah.
It's just that other states do better.
Yeah.
Okay. And again,
the test is the thing.
we have to compare ourselves to the states that have economies like ours, to Massachusetts and Colorado and a set of Virginia, places like that, Maryland, California.
So when you were at, what was the name of the DEC research facility you were at?
It's called the Systems Research Center.
And is that where you met Hank at? Where did you meet Hank? Didn't you guys work together?
Oh, that's a good question. That was years before that.
Before that.
So Hank graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a bachelor's degree and went to work for DEC. And he was on the VAX VMS team. And he was doing essentially their performance analysis tools for VAX VMS. It was a very small team back then. And when was the vaccine introduced? 1978, 79. And we got a very early VAX. And the deal was we didn't have the money at the University of Washington, but we would build the Pascal compiler for them. Remember Pascal, the programming language? Yeah. Because they wanted to sell it to universities, and universities were teaching intro using Pascal. Okay, so my colleague Helmut Goldie led a bunch of students in building a Pascal compiler for the VAX, and I was doing, remember, performance work back then, okay? And so I started doing performance work on VMS, the operating system, and gave a talk or wrote a paper that Hank heard or read, and he got in touch with me and invited me to a DECUS conference. That was the DEC users group. It was a DECUS conference in New Orleans. I still remember this, probably in 1980 or 81, something like that. That was the first time I met him. And we gave a joint presentation on VMS performance.
Wow.
Okay? And then he had me back to DEC multiple times to sort of visit various plants back then. There was a guy named Wayne Rosing who was building a bitmap display for what became for the Microvax at the time, for example. Anyway, and it was neat because the way you flew, you went from plant to plant. DEC had plants all over New England. The mothership was in Maynard, Massachusetts, but there were a set of Vietnam former helicopter pilots who flew a bunch of DEC-owned helicopters between plants. So I got my first helicopter rides going from DEC plant to DEC plant with Hank. He also, as a joke, used to give people directions that involved only making turns at intersections that had McDonald's. Okay, so the first time I went to see him at I forget whether we first met in New England. This is after I'd met him in New Orleans at the Maynard plant or at his house or at a restaurant. But he sent me like all over southern New England to avoid making a turn at an intersection that didn't have a McDonald's. Okay, so I was like to go 2.5 miles and take a right at the McDonald's. Okay, so I'm driving all over in this rental car, and then DEC had a program that would send people off for a year to get a master's degree. And so Hank signed up for this program and came and got a master's degree with me at the University of Washington.
You did?
Yeah. In the very early 1980s, probably 1981 or something like that. Okay. And of course, Hank had already written a book and written a bunch of research papers. So his master's thesis became a book on capability systems, and then went back to DEC and was, I guess, incapable of convincing them to do a workstation at the time. Okay, and he wasn't the only one trying, but they just, I think it's the innovator's dilemma.
Sure.
Right? And they invented mini computers. They were slow into microcomputers and very slow into workstations. And Hank got frustrated, so called me and asked if he could come in here and join the faculty. And we said, sure. And, he's, of course, been an incredible success. He was a success before he got here, and he's even a greater success here. But I was really pleased that we in Stanford were the only two computer science departments that had a department chair who didn't have a PhD.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's great. So Hank is very proud of being a top researcher and practitioner who does not have a PhD degree in computer science.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
I was a TA for his 142 class, which was Intro to C++.
Intro, yeah.
And he was an amazing teacher. I mean, I had him in operating systems.
He's totally gifted.
He was an amazing teacher. He was funny, or is, but was back then as well.
He still is.
Talented, funny, engaging, but I would not use the term friendly. But like engaging in this hilarious way. And so I remember I was TA, and then I met him in his office hour one time because he wanted to talk about something, and he was asking me a question about C++, and I realized he didn't know the language. He didn't know it. He was teaching it, and he didn't know the language. And I explained to him this thing, and he goes, "Oh, I see. The language is broken." That was his pronouncement on. It was like, okay,
That's so good.
I have so many. That guy is
a legend. That's great.
He's funny, man. Okay.
When he was visiting me out here, both when he was back at DEC before he moved here, he used to come out a couple times a year, and he would stay in a room in our house, and he would often do this, and he managed to convince the DEC travel department that if you didn't charge them for a hotel, you ought to be able to buy a bottle of wine for the host and some toy for their kid. Okay, so every trip I would get a nice bottle of wine from Hank, and my two sons, who were like 2 and 4 at the time, would get some. We still have a big moose, stuffed moose, a kid's toy, stuffed moose head hanging on the wall, and
like a kid's taxidermy or something.
yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
It's a plush toy,
Plush
hanging
toy.
on the wall that Hank brought our kid, and a biplane, a stuffed biplane. Toys that he brought our kids 40 years ago.
Oh, that's really fun.
Anyway, yes, and perfectly reasonable for the travel department, but they of course hadn't thought of it until Hank suggested this made sense.
Yeah.
That's great. Oh man.
So did you guys work on anything together at DEC? Any
We worked on performance stuff together. We didn't build stuff, but we sort of.
But you worked on that paper about performance analysis with him.
Yeah, and then when he moved out here, we did tons of stuff.
I see.
Together. I mean, he and I jointly advised a set of phenomenal students, particularly on thread systems using the Firefly multiprocessor that I brought back in 1985 from DEC Circ.
Wow.
Okay, and those are people Tom Anderson, Brian Burshad,
Sure.
John Bennett, a bunch of students like that who did just phenomenal stuff.
When did you do the power of 2 random choices?
Well, I can't remember.
You can't
What is
remember?
that? What is
I can't remember.
I was researching some stuff for load balancing at Uber one time, and I came across this paper and I was like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what we need. Point of the paper is if you have a load balancer, there's an optimal, so I have like 1,000 machines that need the load balance across, right? Yep. There's an optimal way to load balance new connections that are incoming, but that optimal way takes way too long to compute too many resources, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, well, what's a shortcut? And so the power of two random choices is this. What you do is you randomly pick 2 out of your 1,000. You look at their load and you choose the optimal one out of that. And that turns out to have 85% of optimal or some crazy number. It's it's the power of two random choices. And we use that in our load balancers because we were going from 1,000 to 10,000 machines, and it's like super fast. You can imagine how this would be way faster than computing the optimal, and it works so well. So read the paper, we implemented a thing. I went back and looked at the authors. You were one of the authors.
Well, the others were John Zahorian and Derek Eager.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. And Derek also had the same thesis advisor that John and I did, and then we did a bunch of work together. So this was, I think, maybe late 1980s, early 1990s, right? And you're right. This sort of works remarkably well. What it doesn't work for is load balancing what I'll call parallel tasks. Okay, that is fork join synchronization, because there your speed is governed by the slowest one.
Sure, right.
Okay,
right.
But if you're just trying to load balance independent tasks, it's gangbusters, right? It's fantastic.
Because like the odds are. I mean, think about it simply. You take your space in half, terrible ones and great ones. The odds that getting 2 bad ones is less than the odds of getting 2 good ones, or 1 good one and 1 bad one.
Yeah.
So, right? So most of the time, you're going to land in the good.
And the other thing you can imagine is that the marginal benefit of considering additional alternatives goes down very quickly.
Goes down very quickly,
okay.
Yeah.
So 2 does really well, 3 does a little better, 4 does hardly any better. And, even if you're talking about a universe of hundreds or thousands.
I love that.
Fun. Do you remember how you came up with that, or what was happening?
I don't, but I suspect it was Derek's idea. He was the smart one of the 3 of us.
Hey, your name is on it, my friend.
Yeah, right.
But I read the paper.
This is so great to hear.
I went back and looked at the authors, and I was like, oh.
I know. I love that you implemented.
I know these guys.
This is great. Gotta give credit to who this was.
Yeah.
That's
too
really
I think I sent you a note at the time.
I think you did. That's great.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay, so what was the year you started teaching at UW?
1977.
Okay.
40. This will be my 48th year this fall.
I was going to say, come on, 50 years of teaching.
Close to it.
Wow. That 50 years of teaching, almost your 50th wedding anniversary.
But again, my undergrad advisor is in his entering his 60th year.
That's amazing.
That will not be me.
Man. Okay, I have a question for you. In all of your years of teaching, if there's anything along the path that you would have gone back and done differently, would you have done anything?
Oh, sure. I think, for example, here's, it took me, when I graduated from grad school, although I enjoyed being a TA and stuff like that, I thought of myself as doing research. Okay? And it took me a couple of years to realize that the only reason to be a university faculty member is that you're focused on the students. And even when you're doing research with a graduate student, okay, it's in the context of educating them about how to do research. Unfortunately, we don't know how to teach how to do research. All we can do is an apprenticeship program.
Right.
Okay, so that is part of education. Okay, and I think everybody wants to have a multiplicative factor. That is, how can you get more done than you can do by yourself? One possibility is you build systems or write software that thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of people use. And that's the multiplicative factor if you're at a startup or at a Microsoft or something like that. I think about carbon robotics now. If you transform farming and get rid of herbicides, okay, that's a tremendous multiplicative factor out of your tech background. The other multiplicative factor is people. Okay, and if you're at a university, what matters is the people you impact, not any research you do. Okay, and it took me a couple of years to come to that retrospectively obvious realization, okay, which is that I was in the people business.
Yeah.
It is amazing to hear you talk, because so much of Ed's description of his career and times is an overlay of the people involved.
100%.
Right?
It
and think of things in that way. And I've been at these events before. I mean, I go, Ed is at all these events and it's students and all that stuff. And I don't know how he does it because I'm worn out after like 5 minutes. So your social battery must have like solar power on or something because it keeps going. I've never seen anybody who can maintain the level of happy discourse with just random people for hours, the way Ed can. And I think it's got to be an innate part of your personality.
We did an alumni event over at the Woodmark a few weeks ago, and there were people there who I'd taught in like 1980. They're looking as old as I do, and but it's. And some of them I had not seen in a number of years because, we don't do a lot of events on the east side, for example, and you're not going to drive across the darn bridge for an event downtown or on campus. Okay. But it's just, it's so great to see these people and find out what they've been doing. And I am an extrovert, right? And the definition between, you probably know Julie Sandler. She explained to me the difference between introvert and extrovert. To talk to Julie, you would assume she's an extrovert.
She must be. Are you kidding me?
Here's what she said.
She's got a definition where she's an introvert. Then I'm super confused.
Extrovert.
I agree totally. Julie is just, she has more energy than, the Energizer Bunny. And it's just always bubbly and interactive and smart. Okay. But what she said is that the definition of an extrovert is you gain energy from interactions.
Yeah. It's for
and the definition of an introvert is that it sucks energy out of you. Okay. And for her, it sucks energy out of her. Okay. And she manages to disguise that to the extent that none of us would imagine that she's an introvert.
Sure.
Okay. Because she has some incredible storehouse of energy down in her toes that makes it to her face when she's interacting. Okay. Okay. But I think I just gain energy from interactions and just from honestly learning what people have done and what they're doing. And, I think, again, when you work with students, undergraduates, grad students, it doesn't matter. You realize that the majority of their success is what how their parents treated them and the energy and effort they put into it and their own intelligence. But you sort of humor yourself by thinking you played at least some small role. Okay. So you take at least a tiny bit of personal pleasure out of the success people have. And, I run an undergraduate seminar these days, every winter quarter, in which we bring back every week an alum who's out a few years. And the message they're supposed to deliver is, here's some stuff I picked up in my first few years on the job that I wish somebody had told me before. Okay. And you can imagine what those things are, So, for example, how do you deal with a bad manager? How do you change jobs? When do you change jobs? As an intern, you're an apprentice, and the people around you are supposed to know more than you. Now you're a member of a team with people who are 10 years more experienced than you. How do you suggest that a design they're proposing isn't right without seeming like a smartass? These are the sorts of things that these people discuss. But to me, what's wonderful is seeing how much progress, how these people have grown in a small number of years after leaving the program. All right. And perhaps falsely or egotistically or something, thinking that the Allen School and maybe I played some small role in that. But again, it's a tiny role compared to their parents and themselves. But
I don't know. It's a pretty big role in my life.
Again, I don't know.
Big role. I think it goes back to what you said earlier. I think just the affirmation of, like these students are at the peak age of like, who am I? Like, what am I supposed to be? What's my purpose? And then even just having someone affirm you, being, you're good at this. Like that's that's everything. Feels maybe like a small role, but that can be everything for sure.
I mean, it's interesting now because, the increasing scale of the Allen School and the fact that we're in 2 buildings and 2 years of COVID have definitely changed the climate. I think, honestly, the students who spent 2 COVID years in high school suffered
I'm sure they did.
enormously. I think in college it probably wasn't so bad. I have a granddaughter now who's about to turn 5, and she had, she made out like a bandit during COVID. One of her parents was working from home. She had constant adults. Her pediatrician said that, kids who were toddlers at home, preschool age, during COVID are linguistically tend to be more advanced, right? Because they were around adults instead of babbling with other kids.
Yeah.
Right.
At the same time, my son, I remember, brought her for her 18-month appointment with the pediatrician, and he got a form to fill out, which clearly was an autism screening form. Okay, and it was, how does she interact with other kids and stuff? And he looks at the pediatrician and said, how the heck am I supposed to answer this?
Yeah.
Well, this triggered a 15-minute therapy session for the pediatrician because her daughter had been elementary school age and had spent 2 years at home. Okay, so this was the pediatrician talking about how terrible this had been for her daughter. Okay, so my son gave the pediatrician a pro bono therapy session in the process of explaining why he couldn't talk about his kid's experience interacting with others because she just hadn't had the opportunity.
No.
Anyway, I think this has had a serious impact on kids who were not in school for that
Yeah.
Definitely.
period of time.
Yeah. No, all the more difference it makes to have people call it out,
Yeah.
right? And say, hey, like you got this, stick on this path. I think that's going to be really important.
And, we will see how this impacts how work from home impacts productivity at work, right? I read recently that Amazon is going to be a little more strict about 3 days. There was this thing called I forget, the coffee clock or something like that. Where
Coffee badging.
Coffee badges, right. I had not heard that phrase until I read it in the Seattle Times.
Yeah.
But, I think so much happens through face-to-face interactions. And
It's hard. I think you could have, I think it's different. If you're 100% remote and everybody's remote, that's one thing. If it's mixed, I think the people who aren't
I agree.
in the office lose out because, and I've never been in a fully remote situation, but I can imagine it working. But it would only work I think it only works well if everybody's remote.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's my experience anyway. But
Yeah, we spent obviously a year and a half, almost 2 years, fully remote and managed to make that work.
Yeah.
In teaching. The first year we were back, we were supposed to try and do hybrid. And the only thing I did was honestly focus on the people who were physically present because I didn't want to deteriorate that experience, but it didn't mean it was worse for the hybrid people, in fact.
Yeah.
Because I consciously short-sheeted them in order to make it a good experience for the people who were physically present.
Yeah, there's so much about just bumping into somebody and or how many times do you see, especially if you're dealing with hardware, but even you just see what somebody's doing and you go, hey, can I see what you're doing? Can I help you with that? Oh, that I always want to know how to do whatever, which is not something that you'd get just ad hoc being remote, right? You'd have to schedule. I don't know, those happenstance interactions, don't happen, right? There's because there's no way to know, to see what this person is doing and that you have a free moment and it seems that they are working on something you're interested in.
Yep.
Though that kind of interaction does not, maybe there's a way to do it with some software, but how do you do it without sort of spying on people? It's very hard to see how to fix that human social interaction.
Yeah, this is not built into Zoom yet.
Yeah.
As great as Zoom is.
Yeah. We always thought that this would be sort of the utopia because of the traffic problem, all of the environmental damage from driving cars all the time. That with ubiquitous bandwidth, why couldn't we have everybody be completely remote? But then once you see what happens, you start to realize the degree to which the human interactions are the company.
Changing the subject, isn't bandwidth amazing?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Somewhere on the web is the original Real Networks broadcast of a Mariners game.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, and it's terribly low fidelity because it had to run, I guess, on maybe 56K modems. I don't know what modem speeds were at the time. But, they had a codec. They used whatever bandwidth a reasonable portion of the population could get to their home.
Yeah.
And, as bandwidths went up, their fidelity went up.
Yep.
But, this Mariners broadcast sounds like talking on a tin can telephone with strings between them, right?
Yeah,
It's
sure.
It's terrible. And it's not like they couldn't do better. It's like they needed to have an addressable market that was
I think it was 8 kilobit voice
8K?
audio. Yeah, and I kind of remember. Yeah, I wrote a bunch of the server software for that stuff, and what we were trying to do was I came there after the Mariners game, but I remember like some of the big events we had, and everything was because you were just on the edge of what you could do with the bandwidth. Our server software was scheduling UDP packets for delivery just in time. UDP because if you missed the timestamp, you would just throw it away anyway. So there's no sense in retrying.
And vastly less overhead. Right?
Yeah, vastly less overhead. Yeah, and what you were trying to do was get the packet there in time because you didn't have any extra bandwidth at all, really. And the modems had these terminal buffers it was essentially a single buffer. They didn't have an in and out, right? So you were really just trying to stay on the edge of that the whole time. And then, when cable and DSL internet came out to the home, ubiquitous bandwidth. I mean, if you were really paying attention, you would have realized this is the end of the line for this product. And that was when I left. But it's amazing how many people didn't see that and just thought, no, the server software is the core of this company and will continue to be the golden goose. And it's not the case. Bandwidth, because if you look at the problem from an engineering perspective, you go, oh, wait a minute. If the bandwidth is there's some relation to 5x what you actually need, some parallel to the Nyquist frequency or something, you know what I mean, like in a different domain. At some point you just don't care anymore, and you can just do a TCP FAT stream and let the client pull it at as much as it can and buffer it up, and then after that, who cares? You know what I mean? But that makes all the difference, right? Now I can play video games, I can stream VR, I can do everything. And it was back in the day, and not even that long ago, you were fighting for every 56K was a lot, and we were,
Well, one reason that computer scientists missed the web, right, that was done at the CERN physics outfit, okay, is that the protocol is ridiculously inefficient.
It sure is.
Okay?
Yeah.
And, what folks over there realized is that before long it wasn't going to matter.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
Ridiculously
inefficient, and also who cares? Right.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing. You were writing assembly code to build, the hyperlink version that you were working on way back then. But what I'm running now, when I'm running something in the browser, which goes assembly, C, C++, JavaScript, right? Like all this stuff. There's all these virtual layers, and it doesn't matter. Nobody cares.
Right.
So it's super inefficient. There's VMs involved and all this stuff. Who cares? Doesn't matter.
But scrolling back in the late 60s, early 70s, this building-sized computer that was the university's only computer when I was an undergraduate had 512K of memory.
Yeah.
Okay, the operating system took half of it. The jobs ran in the other half.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember when we got our VAX at one point, it had 512K of memory. This was 1980, let's say. And Hank and I got a special deal from DEC for a second 512K of memory. And this special deal was $30,000 for another 512K of memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. But also, when you look at it, I'm amazed. You're amazed at how cheap it is. Look at what it takes to build that, and the fact that you can just go buy these terabyte sticks now is like amazing.
Yeah.
Well, not terabyte, but whatever. But think about everything that built us up to get there, and the fact that I can just order this stuff on Amazon.
Yeah. Right.
It'll show up for me.
But now my little Mac Air has, I forget, 24 gig of memory and
thin little thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But also there's this joke phrase referring to Bill Gates and Gordon Moore. It's what Gordon giveth, Bill taketh away. Okay.
I love that.
But what's wrong about that is that the software does so much more now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
And this is why I'm not as worried as some about the impact of large language models and AI and stuff like that on the computer science workforce. Okay, obviously there are jobs that are going to go away. Routine coding, okay, as opposed to engineering design. Routine coding does not have long to live, I figure. Okay, but on the other hand, our expectations for what we want from computer systems just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. And I just can't imagine that as it becomes easier to produce software, we're going to want more software to do more things. That's just the history. Right?
It's every revolution like this has produced more jobs than it took away.
And and they're going to be different jobs for sure.
They're going to be different jobs.
Okay, and the societal challenge is the pace of change is ever increasing.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. There was a time when 95% of employed Americans worked on the farm. Right, and now it's 3%, and they produce enough food to feed not only this country but others. Okay.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there were many generations over which that transformation took place. So there was a time for people to upskill, not even on a personal basis, on a generational basis.
Yeah.
Okay, and now, boy, it's just generative AI has been a slam for a bunch of people.
Yeah. Sure. It's amazing how ChatGPT kicked everything off. The T stands for transformer, and I don't know when ChatGPT really became a thing. 2021 maybe was when those things started.
A couple years ago.
But where did this come from? The original paper that was proposing transformers came out in 2017 from Google. It was called "Attention is All You Need." The point of the transformer is that it gives you an attention model. We had attention models before this in a different way, but it took that many years for somebody to come up with the implementation. And then you look at this and what was the factor that tipped it into from something like weird and questionably useful to, oh my God, this is amazing, right? People make the argument it was the reinforcement learning, the human feedback that just like crushed it into a form where it was usable, right? And so a lot of that was the hard engineering, right? It was not all of the science of the transformer.
Right. That's right.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of interesting how that came about. But
I mean, the thing to realize is that neural networks go back decades, and they were just a joke for many years. The people who worked on them were, if not ridiculed, at least sort of ignored, I guess. Okay, and it turns out in the fullness of time that kind of has a value.
Yeah, stochastic gradient descent, right, really kind of changed the game. And it's another one of these examples, much like the power of two random choices, where the optimal is impractical, but you get something good enough, and it kind of works.
Yeah.
Stochastic gradient descent is still crazy to me because it's like the analogy would be I'm going to give you directions from here to Portland. And what I want you to do is take all those turns and then sort of apply them in some random order. And you'll approximately get to Portland. And it kind of works. It's amazing how well it works. But if you look at what's happening, it's not obvious at the beginning that this is going to work that way. You could guess it might do something, but you would. So the whole thing about stochastic gradient descent is it turned the neural net into a usable device that we didn't know was actually going to work that well. And it was the GPUs that got us there. The cheap, available vector machines that were meant to be putting graphics on the screen
for gaming, right?
Yeah.
Good old Jensen Huang, he kind of figured this out, didn't he?
NVIDIA took out 3DFX when they got the deal to run the GPUs for the Xbox, the original Xbox. That was what got NVIDIA going. And they beat out, I don't remember how they beat out 3DFX, but at the time 3DFX was the dominant provider of GPU systems for PCs. And NVIDIA got this Xbox contract, and I don't know how, or I don't know the story about what caused them to get that. But what happened then was it was successive generations of a video game, and then I think 3DFX could have still hung and went on at that point, but they they through several missteps were not able to do it. But Jensen, I'm sure was not thinking about AI systems, at the time, right? It was just graphics. It was all graphics. And then there was a crypto side path in there along the way too, right?
Yeah.
But these vector machines, I mean, this is what the old SGI Indigos, right? In your graphics lab, we had access to these, $30,000 machines at the time that we did our graphics on, and they were amazing. You could 3D rotate stuff, and we were doing like anti-aliasing in 3 dimensions and all this stuff. But these were machines that we thought at the time in 94 or whatever, when I took that class, that we were learning something that we were never going to have a practical ability to utilize that skill set in real life ever.
Because of the cost, presumably.
When would you ever get to a machine like that?
Yeah.
Well,
it's an interesting story there, which is that SGI, because their capabilities were unique, had astronomical margins.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I had a friend at the time. He had been a salesperson for Digital Equipment Corporation. Okay. And he got a job offer from SGI, and I told him to take it. Okay. And this turned out to be a complete bonanza from him, which I benefited from slightly. Among other things, he bought himself a beach house on Whidbey Island and let me and my family use it for a week. Okay, but the point was, selling deck computers, you actually had to work at it. His job selling to SGI was to go down to Boeing once a month and ask them how many more they needed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
you bet.
And his commission check would arrive. Okay. Because there was no alternative. Now, the bad news is that when superb PC graphics cards became available, SGI was completely incapable of responding because they had built a corporate structure that couldn't, among other things, they had built a corporate structure that couldn't operate at low margins. Okay. Yeah. Part of what makes Amazon so powerful is that their margins have always been razor thin, right? So they are just experts at being a successful company on tiny margins. And if you do it millions and millions and millions of times a day, then it doesn't matter how small the margins are. As long as they're positive, it goes ka-ching.
Right.
SGI is a good story about research, by the way. Okay. So this will be a bit of a digression, and I will get some parts of it wrong, but there was a fellow named Bob Kahn who, was, among other things, the co-inventor with Vince Cerf of TCP/IP back in the 1970s. But Bob was a program manager at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And he had a set of really interesting programs going on at the time. He was funding some of the very early VLSI, very large-scale integration work. He, having done TCP/IP, funded the Berkeley Unix project, which was a pretty boring project. We stupidly chose not to bid on it, okay? And the reason was it was simply to stick virtual memory into Bell Labs Unix. Why virtual memory? Because the VLSI designs required more memory than you could physically put on the machine. Okay, and Unix was clearly the coming thing.
That was the driver for
you needed somebody to create a large virtual address space on a Unix system. So that was the original goal of Berkeley Unix, except while they were at it, Kahn had them put a TCP/IP stack in it. Okay, and so Berkeley Unix drove the adoption of TCP/IP. And remember, back then there was DECnet. IBM had SNA.
Sure.
Microsoft had, I forget what it was called, but it wasn't very good. Okay, and on and on and on. Okay, there was Apple Talk. Okay, everybody had their own incompatible protocol. Okay, and TCP/IP was sort of the Switzerland of protocols. Anyway, so Berkeley Unix came out with a great TCP/IP stack. Okay, but Kahn was also they needed a workstation on which to run the circuit design software, because not everybody had Altos. Only Xerox had Altos. And the original VLSI work, the Meade-Conway work, was done at Xerox, okay? So he funded Bechtelsheim and Hennessy to build the Sun workstation at Stanford, but mandated that they run Berkeley Unix. Okay, so now you've got Unix with virtual memory, the Sun workstation making VLSI design possible, running TCP/IP. Khan orchestrated all of this from DARPA, but there was a guy named Jim Clark who was a computer graphics faculty member at Stanford. And when he saw this VLSI stuff, he said, geez, I've built this fancy graphic stuff that takes up 3 racks of MSI chips. I bet I could reduce this to integrated circuits. Wow. And so one of the earliest serious projects in VLSI design on the Sun workstation was Clark doing the original integrated circuits that became SGI. Okay. And so it's a very interesting story about how a really visionary DARPA program manager managed to orchestrate a whole bunch of things that totally changed the world, right? And of course, 3Com came out of this, all sorts of stuff came out of it. And
so where did IRIX come from? The SGI Unix, was that?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
I do remember that, because I do remember SGI had their own Unix. And it was weird. It was broken in a bunch of ways. For some reason, because at the UW, we had access to those IRIX boxes. We had access to a bunch of Sun workstations running Spark chips. And all I remember about the IRIX was that it was sitting down and going like, why is it like this? Why do they have their own Unix? And also it was super easy to root for some reason. For some reason, IRIX just had all these exploits. All of your undergrad students could become root on all the SGI machines easily because they just had these like unpatched, glaringly open holes that I guess they didn't care about.
So every VMS system, VAX VMS back in the day, I still remember this, had a system test account. Systest, and the password was UETP, which stood for User Environment Test Package, and nobody ever changed the password. It had root capabilities. Okay, so you could walk into pretty much anybody's VMS system and log in as systest UETP and be root. Okay, and I think this is the wrong week to be talking about computer security, but
possibly.
Be that as it may.
But this is interesting because we've talked about DEC, we've talked about SGI, we've talked about Sun.
There are lots of dead computer companies, aren't there?
All companies that failed to see what was coming. Right? They failed to see what was coming. And in retrospect, you can tell the story in a way that makes it super obvious, right? But at the time, there were some highly paid, there were a lot of highly paid people whose job it was to keep those companies from failing, who completely missed it. Completely missed it, And with SGI, it was graphics cards. With DEC, it was getting to the personal computer. With Sun, I would argue it was Linux. I remember I remember being at AOL with Sujal, somebody that we all know. My co-founder at Isilon, who bought you a staircase.
What's that story?
Thank you, Sujal and Mira.
Thank you, Sujal and Mira, at the new computer science building.
Oh, great! There we go.
So we were at AOL and we got called in because they're having performance problems or whatever. So it's me and Sujal sitting there, AOL people at the table, blah blah blah, and around this room are like 20 Sun sales reps, just like sales reps and sales engineers and all these people. And we're there, and the Sun guy and the AOL guys are livid. They're like the performance is like not where it needs to be on the streaming server, and it's and they threw up all these numbers and stuff, and I go, well, our Linux numbers are much better. And all of a sudden, people like slide their chairs in, and suddenly they're all staring at us and all this stuff. And Sujal just starts going on and on and on about like, it would be nice if we just don't have access to these expensive Sun machines. And I don't know why AOL is buying these expensive Sun machines when these Linux boxes are so cheap. And now these Sun guys they're red in the face. They're angry. And the AOL guy is trying to justify it. And he goes, well, yeah, but we get better support from Sun and the machines last longer or whatever. And I'm like, so buy 10 Linux boxes, for like,
Yeah.
just throw one away.
Yeah.
You're still going to. So anyway, and Sujal was brutal to these guys. I mean, he tore them
That's too
apart.
funny.
It was disgusting. Sujal just destroyed these poor guys. So anyway, we go back to Real Networks the next week, and like a rack full of Sun machines arrived for us to develop.
Hilarious.
But that just represented to me, like one of Sun's big customers on the tipping point of being convinced to completely throw out all that stuff and just buy cheap Intel-based rack-mounted servers, literally a tenth the price. And really, you could just, every time one of them failed, throw it away, and you'd still come out on top. This, and this is what you're talking about: high margin, good business. Everybody's happy. Everybody's fat and happy, right?
Yeah.
And then you don't see it coming.
100%.
So many years ago, I think it was somebody at Google I was talking to, and I think the story is they simply didn't implement free in C, okay? Because people always screw up memory management, okay? So what they focused on was fast reboot.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And every once in a while, so they would simply allocate memory until there wasn't any more.
Yeah.
Okay. And at that point, they would reboot. It may not have been Google, but it was interesting and similar to what you're describing. Okay. Which is you solve the manual dynamic storage allocation mistake problem by just never reusing memory virtual memory that's been allocated. Okay. And you simply reboot quick.
Yeah. Didn't Hank's Opal operating system had some twist on that, right? I thought there was some.
Well, the goal was a gargantuan address space. Okay. So that you would essentially have enough object address space for the entire universe, more or less. Okay. So you would never have to reuse a piece of address space.
Right.
Same thing. Okay. Because we're just very bad at manually managing it.
Right. It's the managing, and then you get into SMP, and it's the locking, and most of the heaps aren't thread safe, and there's all this problem. We did an interesting thing at Clusterix that I haven't seen repeated, but I'm sure somebody's done, where because it was a lot of transactions, it was a lot of user-based transactions. User shows up, does some SQL, has a bunch of allocations. As part of that, there's an optimizer, there's a planner, and all this stuff. That we are free in that system had a heap that we'd pass in. And so the thing was, if you didn't need the free stuff of a lot of these types of things, you would just dump the heap at the end. And that was I like that a lot, because it just meant that you only had to ever focus about it's not our free, our malloc took it.
Malloc, yeah.
Yeah, so you would just pass this heap in, and then if you were one of these contacts, you could just malloc, and then dump the whole heap. There was no free going on. And it allowed for a bunch of different things, but the one thing it really allowed a lot of was it sped up our SMP quite a bit as well. Because the lock, we would always pass back to the originating thread, the responsibility for dumping that memory, so we didn't have to worry about locking it on free, right? It was almost like a capabilities system, and there's an analogy there, but anyway, and then we'd get it back to the originator and just dump that whole heap out, and it worked incredibly well. But
That's so interesting. Okay, Ed, so sorry, not to digress back to another topic, but so going back to, I'd just be curious, like, where you are today, like things you're involved with today. What's top of mind for you? Obviously, you still have some board seats. You're still teaching.
So the two courses I do now regularly, this undergrad seminar I described, which is tons of fun. And then I do an entrepreneurship course with Greg Gottesman from Pioneer Square Labs. And that's just tons of fun. First of all, Greg is just a good human being, aside from being a fantastic VC. And we have about 80 students a year, and they're drawn from computer science at all degree levels, MBAs at the business school, and students from the design school. Okay. And they form essentially teams and bring a project from idea to a demo they can pitch to a bunch of VCs at the end of the quarter. That's just, and these student teams do amazing things. Now, the bad news is the course is badly oversubscribed, and there's a limit to the number of teams we can supervise. So you have a choice of turning away even more students or having teams that are too large. And we're sort of in a middle ground right now where you turn away far too many students, which we don't like to do, but the teams are too large because we can only supervise about 8 projects adequately because they have to pitch every week and stuff like that.
Actually, Ed, I helped judge the last 2 years. It's so impressive, these teams.
They do
and it's fun.
amazing
They're
stuff.
different ages, different programs, and they come together and they have these awesome demos and presentations. It's really
So
fun,
what's great
impressive
is
to highlight.
the community, people like you who give their time for this. This is just, I think tech in Seattle really is a community, and it's so wonderful. And there are a set of things that make it a community. WTIA does, certainly GeekWire does. I mean, GeekWire is just astonishing. But, we have at least one speaker coming a week. The class lasts 10 weeks for 3 hours a night. Okay. Sorry, one night a week for 10 weeks, 3 hours a night.
3 hours a night.
And one of those hours is always 1 or 2 visitors. And people are just great, and, we had Amy Hood this year. We have Rich Barton many years. Andy Jassy has come every year for the past 5 years or so and has brought his wife and daughter. The first time he came, it was the first time his daughter had heard him speak in public.
Oh, that's great.
A dozen or 15 folks like you come to hear the final pitches at the end. And it's just the way the community supports us, supports UW, supports these students is just really remarkable. I mean, it's not like people like Rich and Andy don't have something else to do on a Wednesday evening other than talk to these students. And I have to say, when Andy brings his wife, it just so humanizes things to realize that first AWS and now Amazon is run by a human being who has a life and, a wife and a daughter who,
family. Yeah.
it's so incredible, right?
Yeah.
So, it's a treat. And, the way project courses always work is the way projects, in the industry work, which is with a couple weeks ago, you say to yourself, oh shit, this is, so you begin with these enormous expectations. Okay. And over time, as reality sets in, it sort of scopes down. But then in the last 10 or 15 or 20% of the time, these students pull off something unbelievable. Okay. And, you see the difference between the final pitch to folks like you and the last in-class presentation they did is like day and night, right? And it's just, I have no idea how many hours they put in the last week or two, but it's so gratifying to us and to them to see what happens. But again, to me, just the way the Seattle community pitches in and helps is just so remarkable. And I really think this is a special place.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to see more Seattle VC, honestly, which is what you're helping with Fuse, right? But because too much of our money is still coming from out of state, which tells me that the flywheel is only half started, right? Like what you want is a community where people make money, become LPs or start funds. Those funds fund the local region. There's some of that, but we still have a little ways to go, and I would like to see that turn a little more. Our local funds is like Madrona, Fuse, Voyager,
PSL now.
PSL. Mm-hmm. But who else is?
There's Tola.
Who?
Tola Capital. There you go. Even
I don't know who that is.
Did you say Ignition?
Ignition is wrapped up.
It's wrapped up, and they used to do a lot of out-of-region investing as well.
Yep.
Sure, yeah, but Ignition's great. They're just
wrapped, just gone.
Wrapped.
Yeah.
We need. It is a good place to put capital.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I'd say is that out-of-region VCs and law firms tend to retreat when there's a downturn, and there's always going to be a downturn.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so Craig Sherman has been here forever, right? Which I really appreciate since he's from a great California firm. But there are many other firms that disappeared during one of the past downturns. Yeah. And there are VCs. We had a funding commitment for our first building from Atlas, for example, that we wrote off because they left. And I understand that completely. But, on that building, we only wrote off 2 pledges.
Yeah.
And one was a
was
VC that left town.
Yeah, I remember that. We have to shout out to Annie's Breakers while we're talking.
course.
about
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that because Atlas was our Series A at Isilon, and they thought, okay, we're off to the races, and then that was when they made that pledge and whatnot. And then it was like 2 years later, and everything's crashing. And they're selling the chairs, right, or whatever.
Yeah.
And you told me many years later that they reneged on that commitment, which is lame. They did.
But I get it. They're not part of Seattle anymore. But the point, this is one of many arguments why we need more locals.
We do.
We definitely do. Yeah.
Or even awareness. Yeah, there's Flying Fish, Circano, but I think,
Yeah.
founders even having awareness of who's here.
Yeah, I mean, here's the other thing, which is that VCs set the appropriate market price for things if there are multiple competing. Okay?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think,
Good point.
UW in the past has developed I think UW's tech transfer office, now called Comotion, is doing a fine job these days.
Yeah.
It sort of comes and goes. But there have been times in the past when it was off-putting because they were insisting on terms that many people found unrealistic. But that's because there wasn't a viable market. Okay, there was not a marketplace that set the price. Okay, if there's a marketplace, then the innovator of the technology, the owner of the technology, in this case the university, because what we do is licensed to the university, who then licenses it out. They don't get to set the price. The competitive marketplace sets the price.
Yeah.
Okay. And the price tends to go up when people are bidding against one another. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So more is better.
Yeah.
And I say that with full recognition for how wonderful Madrona has been to us. Madrona has done, I think, 20 companies out of our department. Okay, and have been just tremendously supportive in so many ways. And in the early days, Matt McElwain and now Tim Porter and others, they're like walking the halls and, doing coffee clatches with students and stuff like that. I mean, they have been great, but competition would be good too.
So competition would be great.
That's right.
So you are. So who is the chairman of the department now?
So we became the Paul G. Allen School 7 years ago.
Okay.
And so Hank Levy had been the department chair.
Right.
He transitioned to being the director of the Allen School.
Okay.
And Hank originally signed up for a 5-year term and wound up doing 13 and a half.
Okay.
Rounded out.
And rounded up, and was succeeded by Magdalena Balazinska, who is phenomenal. So she's an MIT PhD who does data management and also really does a great job bringing people together. She created the Pacific Northwest Database Society, for example, which has regular meetings. But she's been spectacular as director of the Allen School.
Okay.
Really, just superb.
Okay.
And we have grown enormously in recent years from your time when there were 80 students to about more than 600 graduates a year now. And that has been through legislative support.
Really? Okay.
And
good. Because I remember they didn't used to. You used to tell me.
They've been great. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think UW is supportive of us, but there are a lot of internal politics, okay, because we're growing faster than any other part of the university, and that gets some people upset. In particular, the dean of engineering does not like us very much and opposes our growth. Okay.
Why? Why?
I am. Let's see. I don't view life as a zero-sum game. There are people who do.
I see.
Okay. My view is we're all in the business of making the pie bigger, so we all get a bigger piece.
Sure.
Okay. And I'm not taking something from your piece of the pie. I'm making the pie bigger.
Okay.
Okay. But not everybody thinks that way.
Okay.
Okay. But the legislature has been great, and Microsoft has been incredibly supportive, and Amazon has been incredibly supportive, and WTIA has been incredibly supportive. And so the result is the legislature has been growing us every biennium in recent years, except for one. And we're still, despite the growth, far below the capacity of really outstanding students. Okay. Right. So we are turning away students who it just makes you want to cry. And our direct admission class this year was more than 90% Washington students because, for God's sakes, it's the citizens paying our bills,
Right.
okay? We're not growing by internal reallocations or by tuition dollars. We're growing because the legislature funds us to grow using corporate tax dollars and citizen taxes, okay? And they don't think they're paying for kids from California and China as much as we love them. But despite that, we are turning away many hundreds of Washington students who would sail into any other engineering program at UW. Okay.
What do you think the size could be, or maybe should be?
I don't
whatever
know, but it could be several hundred a year more than it is now to get us at a par with other units in engineering.
So maybe twice what it is.
Probably not quite twice. If that would be 1,200. But, you know, the business school, for example, at the undergraduate level, they have a bachelor's program is bigger than us. And it's not clear why you need more business graduates at the bachelor's level than you need computer science graduates.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I don't mean as any argument that the business school should be smaller. It's a fantastic business school, particularly at the undergrad level, but we should be bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean,
we should
you
not
can't
be
say it, but I can. I think we need more computer scientists and less MBAs in the world.
But the real way I would put it is as important as other fields of engineering are, it doesn't make sense that we're turning away students from computer science who would sail into any other engineering program.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
It's important for the region. It's important, right? Because we've got to continue to build the region.
Right.
Amazon supporting you, Microsoft supporting you, as you said. I'm sure not altruistically, but maybe a little bit, but because they know that's where the next generation of employees are going to come from.
Yeah, but I also think, you know, let's just focus on Microsoft for a minute. You know, Brad Smith is a god, right? And so much of the good he does is not his day job. Okay. And he really invests in the region. This whole Cascadia effort is Brad. Okay. And the head of the governor's higher ed, whatever analysis committee under Gregoire, that was Brad. Okay. And, you know, the Washington State Opportunity Scholarship, that was Brad and Boeing. Okay. And you know, while everyone operates with a bit of, let's say, enlightened self-interest, I think, Brad is somebody who has a deep commitment to this region and to the kids in this region and to the broad industry in this region and to us. And it's so wonderful to see the impact that Microsoft has. First of all, the positive impact on this region, and secondly, the positive impact on the industry as a whole and the world. I mean, Microsoft is the conscience of the tech industry these days.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And it's just, I mean,
that's an amazing shift too in the last 10,
right. You know,
15,
imagine that Microsoft is the one tech company that the federal government is not going after, you know? Okay. And you know, Brad and Satya are just amazing. And, you know, what the company has done with Azure in the cloud is just mind-boggling. You know, it's just these are good people who not only know how to run a company but have a conscience about what we ought to be doing.
Yeah,
what the tech industry ought to be doing to support the region and the nation.
Yeah, there has been a shift certainly in the last decade of maybe it's since the Ballmer years. I don't really know, but Microsoft being much more the tech community instead of the, you know, like, at least from my perception, the like curmudgeonly angry, you know, used to be group that makes Windows and doesn't want to hear about Linux and doesn't like open source software and, you know, thinks a database should cost you $30,000 a year.
Well, I think Satya flipped a switch.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and you know, again, another amazing person.
Yeah, it's way different now. It feels like part of the tech community.
Yep. And, you know, Amazon has made huge investments in downtown Seattle.
Sure.
In housing issues, for example, things like that. I mean, they really, I think, focus on the city of Seattle, but they've had an enormous positive effect.
Sure. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of those, if nothing else, just increasing the tax base, high paying jobs, you know, work that isn't bad for you to be doing, you know, it's not bad. It's mind stimulating work that's not bad for your body, and in most cases is trying to do something good for society,
So now you've triggered another rant on my part, okay, which is I think as a city, we're always looking for somebody else to blame for what are our self-inflicted wounds. Okay? And, there's a lot of people who complain about South Lake Union, and, we want more low-cost housing, we want more parks, it's too crowded, let's ignore the COVID downturn and stuff like that. It's all Amazon all the time. These people undoubtedly forget what South Lake Union was in 1990.
Oh, wow,
okay, it was a bunch of you grew up here, right? It was a bunch of one-story warehouses,
right.
Many of them with broken windows, and
right.
parking lots with nothing in them.
Yeah.
Okay, and in the early 90s, there was this citizens initiative called the Seattle Commons. Okay, and the idea was to build a park and some tech space for bio and computing and some mixed income housing that would stretch from South Lake Union all the way to West Lake Park.
And Paul Allen had a big part of that too, right?
Right. Okay. So I'm getting on the we blame Paul and Amazon for South Lake Union. Okay. Right. And what Paul did, because he again is somebody who's deeply invested in Seattle, was, I'll get the details wrong, I always do, but he loaned $20 million to the Seattle Commons effort so they could start buying up parking lots before the price got jacked up. And they did that. And the deal was he would forgive the loan when the citizens voted for the Commons.
Oh, wow.
And we voted against it not once, but twice. Wow. Okay. At which point Paul said, well, screw it. I'll do the best I can myself. Okay. So on one hand, it doesn't perhaps quite achieve the vision we had for it. Okay. On the other hand, it's one hell of a lot better than what had been there before.
Sure.
And we voted against our vision not once, but twice, for God's sake.
Wow.
So, why point the finger at Paul and Ada Healy, who runs his real estate business, and Amazon, when in fact what we have there is just so vastly better than the crap that was there before. I don't know if you remember this, but when Paul convinced the city to run the light rail from Westlake down to South Lake Union, it was called the Westlake to Hooters Express.
Yeah.
Because there was nothing at South Lake Union except for a Hooters, right? Yeah. And so this damn thing ran empty from Westlake to the Hooters, except for the occasional businessman who wanted to oogle the waitresses in the orange bras, I guess, back and forth, empty. Okay, between Westlake and Hooters, and that's what we had down there. There was. I remember when my kids were younger. At one point, they were still home, going down to there was a coffee shop down there that was selling "Ride the Slut" T-shirts. Okay, Slut was the South Lake Union trolley. I got my kids bright red "Ride the Slut" T-shirts as Christmas presents. Anyway,
really
and similarly, we have. A transportation problem, but until recent years, we voted against every reasonable transportation measure. You've been to Atlanta. BART is our light rail system. Okay, one of our senators identified, I'll get the number wrong, $900 million in federal pork to build us a light rail system emanating from downtown, and we had to put up 10%. And we voted that down.
Wow.
And Atlanta said, hey, we need a light rail system. So they put up the money and they got the pork that had been set aside, okay, and built BART, okay? And now, we're finally doing light rail, but had we done it many decades ago, areas along the light rail wouldn't have been built up and we'd be able to more easily have high density housing. I spent 5 years at grad school in Toronto, and the early legs of the subway system, they were built in the 1950s. And if you go up the CN Tower and look north, you see these gigantic 25, 30-story apartment complexes every mile and a quarter where the subway stops are.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what we could have here if we had put light rail in before things got built up. The other story is I understand that Almweg, who built the monorail between Westlake and Seattle Center for the 62 World's Fair, offered to build it down to the airport if we would find the right of way for them, and we turned that down too.
When was that?
Well, it had to be 1960.
Yeah, way back when they were first built.
I have not confirmed that story, but I've heard it enough that I suspect it's correct.
I was here in the 90s when they were trying to build a monorail system, and I remember that whole thing.
And a monorail is probably not what you would build these days, but having one in 1960 that went to the airport would have been pretty
Could
cool.
have done it, yeah.
I mean, I live in Ballard, right? And there was the green line that was supposed to be a monorail that got to Ballard.
That's right.
The result, in fact, has been positive. There's a whole bunch of apartments that were built around 15 and Market in the expectation that there would be decent transit to there. And they're all occupied. So Ballard, for that reason and others, is less the purely Scandinavian hangout that we remember.
Yeah.
I mean, my wife and I have been there for 46 years now. And for the first 30 or so of those years, it was a lovely place to live and raise kids, but it wasn't exactly cool. And you were mentioning you were at Ray's last night, for example. I mean, we never leave Ballard for restaurants or bars or anything like that. And many of them are walking distance from our house. Why would you go anywhere else?
Well, exactly.
Right? I mean, people want me to meet them for dinner in Capitol Hill. I say, what are you thinking? You know, that's,
Yeah, no thanks.
That's forever and away.
Yeah. Oh, it totally is.
We do, I think, like comparing Seattle to San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C., Paris, London, like these places that have easy access to good public transportation. It is weird that Seattle doesn't have that.
It is so weird.
Just comparatively, because all of these other places seem to have it. Having experienced it in San Francisco, I took BART every day in San Francisco.
Yep.
Every day and on the weekends. That was my main getting around. And when you have that, then you don't have to. It saves parking. It saves traffic. It makes it so that it's just very easy to go somewhere.
It extends where people can live and still work downtown.
It extends where people. Yeah, that's the reason why.
And we're seeing that now, right?
Yeah. But
And
I
again,
don't know if this is gonna. I don't know that I trust the Seattle's ability to build infrastructure until I see it, because having lived through the monorail situation in the 90s, and then I read how fast they think this train is going to go, and it's not very fast, right? The BART was developed in the 70s. And I think tops out about 60 miles an hour. And this one, I think, tops out at like 40 or 42 or something. Developed, right? That's the face I make.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened there. I don't know if it's because it was developed originally as an extension to the existing system that goes to the airport. The existing system had to go over the road and intermingle with the cars. So then you have to have a system that maybe doesn't have the same top end, and now we want to use the same cars and blah, blah, blah. I don't know how we got here, but.
Well, I think, the thing about a tracked system is all parts have to run at the same speed.
Right.
And there are parts of this that, cross busy streets.
Sure.
In Beacon Hill and places like that. So
Right.
that in some sense, the speed you can go there gates the speed of the entire system. Otherwise, everybody would just stack up behind the train at Beacon Hill.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so that governs the speed of the entire system.
Yeah.
Still, it's a lot better than it used to be. I have to say, it has changed my ability to get downtown from UW.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Just, one stop, Capitol Hill, and then you're at Westlake. So
that leg's off.
that's fantastic. Yeah. And I bicycle to work, and, I used to bicycle downtown for meetings, and, rain or shine. And, I would arrive down there like a wet rat. And, now, boy, it's desk to meeting. It's a half hour.
Yeah.
From
Where's the nearest stop to where you are at the UW?
the stadium.
At the stadium. Oh, yeah.
Okay. And actually, I because my bike has, clip-on shoes and is expensive enough, I don't want to leave it locked outdoors in the U district. I typically take a Lime bike from my office down to the subway station. Okay. That saves me a few minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lime bikes are great, actually. I love them.
Yeah. I mean, they are great when they operate. I've had a lot of.
It's often disappointing that you come to a Lime bike and, you try it and you get the sad face. But
Sure.
nonetheless, they're good. There was it's really interesting. There was a guy from Cornell who did a bunch of work for New York City on their bike share program, and he gave a talk out here many years ago when Seattle's first city-owned bike system was not at all successful. Okay, and the city's argument was, we have hills and people need e-bikes. And e-bikes are great. All the Limes are e-bikes now. My wife has an e-bike. It used to be that we never rode together because she couldn't keep up with me, and now we never ride together because I can't keep up with her, But what this guy from Cornell said was that there was only one other city with a failed bike share program, and that was a city that was dead flat. And what it had in common with Seattle was strict enforcement of helmet laws. Okay, now I say this as somebody who will not get on a bike without a helmet, and neither will my kids or my wife. But they have stopped enforcing the helmet laws. Okay, and that
I can't even remember the last time I've seen someone with helmet on with those.
on a lot exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is, if you need to rent a bike, with the exception of someone like me who rides to work but then takes a Lime bike to the light rail station, okay, you probably don't have a bike because you're renting a bike, and that means you don't have a helmet. And at Google, they have these boxes of helmets for when you ride a bike. You just take a helmet out of the box, and you're trusting that your fellow Google employees don't have head lice.
I was just going to say,
Sure.
Right. That's not going to be so much the case for a rent a bike in Seattle, right? It's unlikely I'm going to take some, community property helmet and pop it on my head.
A little hard stomach.
That's really interesting, though. So this is another one of those areas where the focus on safety, right, restricts the growth of the system that you're trying to promote, right?
I think that's what the Cornell fellow said in quite a convincing way. And it certainly is the case that on one hand, we have lots of e-bikes now, but on the other hand, we have no helmets on them.
Yeah.
And again, I would not get on a bike without a helmet, for gosh sakes.
I can't stomach is the scooters. People on no helmets on these scooters, the number of wipeouts I've seen happen in front of me.
Well, so a friend of mine has said that they are in fact far more dangerous than the bikes.
I could believe it.
And the reason is most of us in our adult lives, even people who aren't bike commuters, are bike periodically, okay? And most of us have not used a scooter since we were 6, okay? So the good news about the scooters I've used recently, I forget whether they're Birds or Lime, is they restrict the speed for your first couple of rides, okay? And that at least gets you back on it without going 20 miles an hour. But all these things are allowed to go 20. Okay, and that's I'm not going that fast without a helmet,
I take those things I take them off curbs and stuff all the time. I never have a helmet.
Well, I don't doubt
I'm all
you,
over the place. But I think
doubt your ability.
But there is a stability difference there too. So bicycle has big wheels. Right, with a lot of momentum,
centrifugal force, right?
Force to keep stabilize.
Those
little tiny wheels on the scooter are less stable, and you can feel how easy it is for that thing to wobble. So I think that there's a real physics thing about scooters versus bikes as well. It's not. I don't think it's just experience level. I think it's the stability of the platform.
We need you. You should buy a helmet.
Yeah, I have a helmet.
Wear the damn thing, Paul.
I grew up in the 70s, man. In the 70s, we were riding our BMX bikes all over the place. My head is thick from all the
knots.
Normally I wear a helmet. There are occasions where I'm in the downtown, I want to hop on a bike, I don't have the helmet, whatever, it's scooter, it's like.
Yeah, I think what it is, it's people catching like a lip or an edge, like going on the main road. I've seen that. I've seen people go like head over handlebars on the
That's why skateboards and scooters are a lot more
makes sense.
Dangerous than bicycles, just if you're cruising around like that.
For a couple of years, I rollerbladed from Ballard to UW for work.
There we go. Now
that was like 6.5 miles. I don't do that anymore, but that was death-defying.
Wait, what trail? How do you do that?
There was no trail.
Yeah, you were just on the street.
I'm sorry, I was on the trail starting at Hales.
Okay.
But that's still more or less the state of the trail in Ballard, right? We still have the missing link. And one of these days it will be finished. I'll be dead by then, I'm sure.
Oh man.
So then you have like favorite streets to get down and go through, and there's some broad sidewalks on Leary and stuff like that. Yeah, when I ride my bike to work, downtown from here, it's still. I hit the 90 trail and it's great, but then once I get to Seattle, it's a lot of like this. And, all of that.
Oh, that's great. Oh man.
What's the most interesting? What's the most interesting thing happening at UW today? At UW CompSci, what's happening?
Well, it's all AI all the time.
Yeah.
And
so I've heard.
A lot of it is, very cool applications in addition to the fundamental stuff. Okay. So for example, Shwetak Patel, and he and his students, a huge number of really innovative uses of the sensors on cell phones for medical screening and diagnosis. They do much more than that now, but it's amazing that you can, for example, take your blood pressure with a cell phone. wouldn't think that was possible, right? But
Right.
tons of this. And one of the really interesting things is we have a special just for us deal that allows faculty members to be involved with companies at a significant percentage on a more or less permanent basis. Okay. And the normal university rule is you can be gone for 2 years and then you either have to come back 100% or you have to resign.
Right. I remember this from the late 90s.
Right.
A lot of your professors were having to make that
It's
decision.
still that case everywhere. Okay.
Yeah,
And we saw Stanford lose many of their top AI faculty by being rigid. So they lost Sebastian Thrun and Andrew Ng and Daphne Kohler. These are leading lights of AI, and they left because Stanford was inflexible.
Oh, Andrew Ng left? I didn't even know
Yeah,
that. Oh,
a while ago. And we, I think, came to the conclusion that if we could manage these things so everybody benefited, okay, that is the person, the company, the university, the students, okay, so you have to be very careful about it.
Right.
It would be a competitive advantage for us if
course it
people could have long-term engagements for a bunch of reasons. And from the faculty members' point of view, even if you don't want to raise your salary, okay, if you are spending time at a Google or a Microsoft or a Facebook or an Amazon, you have access to vast amounts of computes. You have access to an engineering staff.
Right.
You have access to data.
Right.
Okay. You have access to you have access to research funding. Okay. Without writing damned grants. Okay. So even if you didn't want a salary boost, there's all kinds of reasons to do this. So, the basic, I'll give you the high level version of this. There are a lot of details, but like anywhere, you can be gone 100% for 2 years. Okay. After that, there are some other versions of this, but you can be 50% for up to 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And after that, you can continue at 50% by resigning half your faculty position. Okay. So that lets us hire somebody into the half position that you vacated, or two half positions. Okay. And then we can hire you back later on if you want without going through a formal recruiting process. If we have the money, we can just vote you your half a position back. So we have 19 people doing that now. And they are doing it with Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Cruise, NVIDIA, the Allen Institute for AI. Okay. And NVIDIA is a great example. Jensen approached a robotics faculty member of ours a few years ago and said, come to California, leave UW, open a robotics research lab for us. And he said, no, open it in Seattle, and I'll run it 80% for 2 years and then 50% thereafter. And Jensen said, sure. So we have a 40-person robotics operation, 10 minutes from just 10-minute walk from my office. Okay. That wouldn't be in Seattle if it weren't for this.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay.
Nice.
And so this is it's a very powerful situation. And these, in many cases, for example, Facebook, AI2, these companies are the part of the Facebook AI research. Sorry, it's now called Meta Fundamental AI Research.
Oh, it is?
Well, it was FAIR. Facebook
Still used to
AI.
it as fair.
I know.
Right?
It's still FAIR. It's just Meta FAIR.
Oh, metafair.
Okay.
Okay.
They kept the FAIR. The F changed from Facebook to fundamental. Okay.
Got it. Okay.
But they're entirely they're entirely open.
Nice.
Okay. So students and faculty move back and forth. You don't have to have this partitioning between your work here and your work there. Okay. Steve Seitz years ago. This began with Schwedek, and I'll get back to him in a sec. But Steve took a 2-year leave and built a group at Google in Seattle that does all their AR, VR content creation software. Okay, so for example, years ago, the software that takes this circular array of 16 GoPro cameras and turns it into a VR video is something Steve's group did. They're working on sort of augmented reality teleconferencing these days. But Steve, on a 50% basis for many years now, has run that group, which he built in Seattle. Okay, so that stuff is at Google in Seattle, run by Steve. Schwedek's startup company got acquired by Google. That's how this began. Okay, and Schwedek for a number of years now has run Google's health devices business.
Wow.
Okay, and the centroid of it is in Seattle. They have people all over the world, and Schwedek runs at halftime. Okay, and it's just and it gives Schwedek access to all kinds of data from Fitbits, which Google owns and which reports to him. that lets him understand, for example, that you can detect the onset of certain illnesses weeks in advance of clinical manifestation of symptoms.
Wow.
Through things like heart rate.
Yeah.
Okay. And it was just, you'd never have access to that volume of data
Right.
at a university, right? But it's just an example of the benefit of this. So Google's health devices business is headquartered in Seattle, run by Schwedek, who has access to all sorts of really intriguing data that drives his UW research based on experience at Google.
Wow.
So this is supposed to be extended to other engineering units at UW at some point, but right now it's just for the Allen School for the last few years. And I have to give UW enormous credit for being willing to let us try this. Okay, and Magda Balazinska, who I mentioned, deserves a lot of credit too, because Hank Levy and I had been doing this on an ad hoc basis for, we started this, and the person who runs academic human resources was getting ever more grumpy, so we had to fight every year harder for these things. Okay, and Magda took a risk, and successful risk, and bet that she would be able to get something like we had been doing approved as a formal policy.
Wow.
As opposed to us winging it and trying to fly below the radar.
Yeah.
Okay. And she did this. So now it's a real live, it's called a policy exception, because it's an exception for us from the standard UW policy.
That is a huge risk, because if she had done that and then failed, it would have been worse.
Well,
than not doing it.
Undoubtedly, she sniffed around and tested the waters in a few more metaphors first, okay? But it's just to her credit, she's turned this into something real. So there's no longer any questions asked. We just have to abide by the policy, okay? And
industry cross-pollination is probably great in a lot of different, all kinds of ways.
And look, these companies invest back. For example, we have an AR/VR research operation in the Allen School that is supported by hundreds of thousands of dollars a year over multiple years from Facebook, Amazon, a bunch of different companies. We have a future of cloud infrastructure research organization that 6 companies support, including Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year into our research programs. And, at the same time, there are many people at Google, aside from Schwedek, some of them working on cloud infrastructure sorts of stuff, data center networking, things like that. Cool. And so during the leave period, okay, it's annually renewable. And the university is worried about intellectual property conflict of interest, which has never been a problem. Yeah. Okay. People know how to keep their noses clean. Sure. Our concern is conflict of commitment. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So our review process in the Allen School is entirely conflict of commitment. Okay. So, how many hours on which days are you going to be physically present? Who are your students? How are they being advised? How are they being funded? How often are you meeting with them? Okay. Right. What are the courses you're going to teach prorated on the percent of your leave? What are the service obligations you're going to fulfill prorated on the percent of your leave? Okay. So for us, it's, are you maintaining your first commitment to the Allen School and to its students. Right. Okay. So from our point of view, it's student interests that have to trump everything. And if this can't be done in a way that protects and really enhances the interests of students, then we're not going to do it.
Yeah. Okay. It's a great program, though, because it sort of admits the reality of the temptation. Because if you make this hard line, you're either professor or you're with the startup, the money, the access. And
by the way, some of these are startups, but many are not. Many are the top existing companies.
Sure, yeah, okay?
That's right? Great too.
Yeah, that's great.
It's been really successful. Nobody has been taking advantage of it. It benefits everybody, and UW took a risk by letting us try this, and we made it clear that this was an experiment. Yeah. And we were going to figure out how to run it. And the provost at the time said, okay, give it a try. And
that's great.
Now they've signed off on it.
How long has this been going on?
Well, on a fly-by-night basis for probably 8 years, as a formally approved policy for probably 3 or 4 years.
Oh, right. Cool.
Okay. And the other thing is that the tech industry in Seattle is almost unique. I mean, Stanford has access to something like it, but, Boston is like, all bio all the time these days. Okay. There's much less computing there than they used to be. And Austin doesn't have anything like what we have. I think of where the great computer science departments. Georgia Tech's in Atlanta, and it's really a communications hub. It's not really a tech hub. Cornell in Ithaca, New York, as an entrepreneur there, all you can do is study and drink, right? So there's not a lot in Ithaca, New York. There's not a lot in Madison, Wisconsin. Right. Okay, so this is a nearly unique competitive advantage for us.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of how close we can get to industry without leaving town.
Right.
It's really
And in that way, it really benefits the students directly, and it benefits the region.
Sure.
absolutely
Good.
That's really
I have to say, by the way, Anna Marie Kause has announced that she's stepping down as president at the end of her second term. So she's done 9 years now. She'll do a 10th year. And I think, again, I went to a snotty East Coast private institution, but when I came to UW, I really came to embrace the role of a public university. Okay. And I think Anna Marie has restored us as the University of Washington. Okay. And I think if you scroll back a few decades, we were trying so hard to become a leading national and international university that we lost track of the fact that we're the University of Washington.
yeah
Okay. And one of the many really good things Anna Marie has done is restore that, that we can do both. You don't have to choose whether you're going to be national and global or local. You can do both of those things. Okay. And I think that's really important. Okay.
Good.
that's really
Great. Okay, what else should we touch on? Any other things?
I don't know. I'm getting tired. How about you?
Yeah.
We're working you. We're working
Yeah.
you. Okay, how about last question? If you had any advice that you'd give to any aspiring students interested in computer science or in this of it, what would your advice be to anyone who tunes in on this podcast?
So let me give more general advice.
Great.
Okay.
Even better.
When somebody comes to me and says, what job should I take, or what school should I go to, or what city should I move to? Here's my advice, and I give the same spiel to everybody. Okay, we're all very quantitative, and either on our laptop or in our head, we have a spreadsheet. Okay, and the spreadsheet has options in the rows, and it has criteria in the columns. Okay. And each option has a score for each criterion. Okay. And each criterion has a weight that applies to all the options. Okay. And so you fill out this spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet tells you which gets the highest score. That's what you should do. Okay. And at some point, you find yourself screwing around with the weights. Okay. And the reason you're screwing around with the weights is that your heart is telling you to do something other than what the spreadsheet is telling you to do.
Yeah.
Okay. And at that point, you should do what your heart is telling you to do.
Oh, that's
Okay.
great.
And the reason is you've already eliminated the completely nonsensical possibilities. They're not in the spreadsheet anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. If it's in the spreadsheet, it's plausible. Okay. And also, there are going to be factors that you didn't even think of as criteria in your spreadsheet that are going to wind up being really important, and you just can't predict what they are. So do what your heart's telling you to do, okay, what your passion is, and then set all second thoughts aside and make that successful, because your attitude is going to be what dominates, okay? So the message for a kid, a prospective student, is do what you love. Okay. And realize also that what you love now may change while you're in college, or may change later on, or gosh knows, as a guy who's had the same job for 47 years, I now see our students who have 6 jobs in 10 years. And those are some of our most successful students. They just change what they do, and so, you got to be flexible. You got to be learning all the time. You've got to contribute and help other people, because ultimately your next job is going to be gotten by people who fetch you because you did a great job with them on your previous job. Okay. And, companies do most of their hiring these days by employee referrals. And the people you refer are the people who supported you in your, and did great work with you in your previous life. Okay. So this is not building a network by having beer and brown nosing and kissing up to people. It's building a network by doing a great job.
Yeah.
And by helping others, and that realize if you help others, you're going to get more help back than you gave. Okay.
What you give. That's
So,
very good.
so that's the message. It's help other people and follow your heart, and don't do computer science because there are high paying jobs at the end. There are, but do it because you love it. Okay? You're challenged by it or something like that. Don't do it because your parents tell you to do it. Do what you love to do and you'll be fine.
It's awesome.
Right
Ed?
on.
Yeah.
All right, Ed. Well, you're an inspiration to all of us. You've had an incredible impact on myself and the region. We appreciate you. Thank you for coming by today.
Great to do this. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Thanks to both of you.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Tech Out West.
Be sure to follow us on Twitter and YouTube. And of course, reach out with any ideas of who you want us to interview next at techoutwest@gmail.com. We'll see you on the next one.